Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Hello, I hope you enjoyed lunch. Thanks to Beeline Catering for that. That was awesome, Gus. Thank you so much, as always. I hope you found it very good because we have dessert coming later. So be sure to stick around for our afternoon break. That's where you're going to be able to meet a lot of the people you're going to see on stage. You're going to be able to break it down with them privately. In the meantime, we will have a Q&A opportunity in several sections of today's program. That'll be at the mic in the middle here. We're going to ask that you line up if you have questions. That way, that'll cue the speakers that they have questions. Anyway, my name is Matthew Sabellis. I'm the Director of Programming for Live and Virtual Events at Education Week, and I am here to welcome you to 2020 Vision, Ed Policy and Politics Beyond the Midterms. Pardon me. I have a few housekeeping notes. This is the most complicated one, so I hope you're taking notes. This is also on your card. If you got the postcard, this tells you how to get on the Wi-Fi in case you're looking to do that today. In your Wi-Fi settings, you're going to go to GW Connect. You'll see that on the screen here and on the screens up here. Then you'll need to go, it'll say need an account, click here. You're going to set up an account. It will then ask you to select register and submit that. Then you'll get a text and an email back with your username, and text or email back with your username and ID, and then you'll be able to log on with your user ID and passcode. The Education Week seeks to constantly improve the quality of our live events, and this event and the program and the way we've structured it has been in response to the 2016 events that we did with you here with our host, the George Washington University Graduate School of Education and Human Development. Be sure to fill out the survey. The hashtag is bit.ly/edelect2018. We hope you'll take our online survey. That's bit.ly/edelect2018. We also want to let our live stream viewers know there's hundreds and hundreds of you. Thank you so much for your interest today. Please consider also doing that survey. We want to know what your experience is. We want to know that we want you to know that to feel at home and that you're also welcome here. Most of us, most of you anyway, should be familiar with Education Week, but Don Lee is here from our group online subscriptions team. Don, yeah, thanks for waving, Don, that's Don. And he'll be here all day and can share with you how you can get Education Week at your schools and universities. And on this slide, you'll see, last slide, I'm sorry, next slide. Yeah, Don will be able to tell you a little bit more about where to begin so you can have those in your campuses. Be sure to say hello, grab a minute with him. He'll be here at the break as well. The top school jobs. On this slide, you're going to see information about EdWeek's job board, Top School Jobs, which is completely free and for all individuals looking for jobs in education. You'll find teaching jobs, administration, even education policy and nonprofit jobs. Thanks for all you nonprofit folks who are in the audience from the DC ed community. We'll also find a free resume review, online job fairs, and interview tips and career advice for hiring managers. We want to encourage everybody here to use the hashtag EdElect18 today, which you'll see on just about every slide of the presentations. And use them in your tweets and posts, and tell your colleagues you were here when it was first said, here at the podium and here on the stage. For those of you who are on Instagram, we're going to be posting Instagram stories today throughout the day. Please follow us. You can go to @EdWeekEvents, and you'll see them there. We will be uploading pictures throughout the day, and one of them could be you. Smile for our photographers. We have an exciting agenda today. It's full of unique interviews and question and answer from you, the audience. We want to encourage you all to network here in the room and at the Jack Morton Auditorium mezzanine, where you'll be taking that break at it'll be happening today around 3 o'clock because we have a surprise guest for you today. We'll be taking that break together, and we hope we'll think through the first half of what you've experienced and come back for a compelling second half of your day. But before we dive deeply into the content of today's, I'd like to take out a few moments to thank our host here. The Graduate School of Education and Human Development here at the George Washington University has been pivotal for this relationship. Dean Michael Foyer, and Education Week's Deputy Managing Editor, and myself, and my associate, Rebecca Hine, have worked doggedly for several months, developing today's program, bringing today's speakers, and working through a group of what we believe will provide eye-popping and insightful information for you, leaving you with what we hope will be a sense of purpose and mission. All of this would simply not be possible without the contributions from Dean Foyer's entire team here. I'd like to thank Tehran Waters, Meg Holland, Max Freund, Victoria Michaelewski, especially Victoria, your help with registration today. That was a new task for you today, so thank you so much for helping us. Cheryl Pascal and all of the folks here at the Jack Morton Auditorium are helping us in the tech booth and here at doing tech with the microphones throughout the day. Now, without further ado, if I may, I'd like to introduce to you Dean Michael Foyer.
Thank you, Matthew, and welcome everyone to the George Washington University. Before I get into my regular remarks, which I promise will be brief, I know people who know me are saying, there he goes again, promises that won't be kept. Another round of applause for our fabulous team that made all of this possible. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to have this opportunity. Just a word about the George Washington University. In just a couple of years, we're going to be celebrating our bicentennial. This whole institution began as a dream that President Washington had to establish in the nation's capital an institution of higher learning devoted to the public good. And sure enough, here we are, almost 200 years later, in an event that is very much about the public good. It's a pleasure, as I said, and an honor to partner with Education Week, which I believe is unquestionably the most reliable and authoritative source for news and commentary on American elementary and secondary education. The press and the academy are naturally partners. We come to our work with different tools and traditions, but we are both in the business of free and independent inquiry and the supply of evidence to inform public policy. In her masterful new history of the United States, Jill Lepore, in a book called These Truths, reminds us that the American Revolution was not just a radical experiment in government, but also, and perhaps as importantly, a revolutionary affirmation of inquiry and evidence as guarantors of freedom. If I read her correctly, it is true that our Constitution eventually codified the guarantee of a free press, but in fact, first it was our free press that had made possible the revolution itself. So, welcome back to GW, our friends from Education Week, and special thanks to its current editor-in-chief, whom I have the pleasure of introducing now. Scott Montgomery joined Education Week and its parent, Editorial Projects in Education, as editor-in-chief and chief content officer in July 2017. He had been the managing editor of audience and partnerships at NPR. Montgomery has worked in journalism for such outlets as the St. Petersburg Times, Congressional Quarterly, Roll Call, before joining NPR in 2012 and serving in various digital news positions. At the St. Petersburg newspaper, now called the Tampa Bay Times, he led a team that won the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting for PolitiFact, an online political reporting effort. At the risk of sounding partisan, but in fact, what I believe is going to sound utterly American, and I'll say this as loudly as I can, in spite of what you've heard lately, the press is not an enemy. It is a friend of the people. And Education Week is a friend of GW. Please welcome Scott Montgomery.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm probably a new face to most of you. I'm the new editor of Education Week. Came in 2017. And it really is an honor to be here today among all these education professionals and now some politicians. I do want to take a quick moment and welcome the folks who are joining us through the live stream. If you're watching on your phone or your tablet, we're glad to have you with us, and I promise we're going to keep you interested, engaged along the way. As the dean said, I came to Education Week a little over a year ago. In a previous life, I'd been the editor of Roll Call. He mentioned the St. Petersburg Times. I was the government politics editor there. And so when I got a chance to come back and do an election policy meeting, I was kind of excited about it. It was a little bit of a return to my roots. But this is a different kind of an event from the ones that I've done in the past. And I'll tell you why. It's not just because the times are different, though I think the times are different. But really, it's because in my old job, my old boss used to call it the map and the math. That was the stuff we would talk about, the map and the math. You know what I mean, like talking about numbers and talking about trends and outcomes and all that stuff. And we may do a little of that, but that's not really what this is about for us. At best, that kind of work is valuable because it helps you understand what has happened and why. At worst, it can be a little bit of politics by, board game. So for us today, we're not going to focus on the map and the math, although I think we might do a little of that. We're here with George Washington University, a great friend to Education Week. We're so grateful for this relationship. And at Education Week, we cover elections not for the results, actually. We cover them for the consequences. It certainly has been an interesting election season. And I'm not going to begin to summarize it. I don't have the guts to characterize it. But we've seen some things that we haven't seen before this year, and some things that we hadn't seen in a while. For one thing, education policy and spending was actually a driving force in several pivotal states. We hadn't seen that in a while. Mostly in state house races and governor's races. There were a lot of local initiatives on funding. And then we also had, as you all know, an enormous, remarkable civic engagement by the K-12 community in elections. We had students doing huge voter drives with buses and national media attention. And obviously, we also had teacher rallies and teacher candidates by the score. At Education Week, we actually counted 170 educators on ballots around the country. In fact, we had to create a database just to try to keep track of them all. And I know that we actually made that public, and some folks helped us by finding races we hadn't seen. So if you were one of those people who alerted us to a race with an educator in it, thank you. We need that kind of help. But of course, all of that activity wasn't just for civic pride. I mean, it's fair to say that it suggested a certain amount of dissatisfaction with the state of things. If you set the results aside and you just look at that activity, that kind of civic momentum, I think it's fair to say that for some people, our system of politics, our system of education, are not meeting their expectations. So consequences. So today we're going to dive into some of the consequences. And I want to take a moment now, when you look at the program we have today, I want you to notice how many educators and former educators are part of it. Yeah, we have some smart strategy folks. But this isn't a program filled with punditry. We're going to dive deep into the implications of what we learned from Election Day. So we'll also have a handful of Education Week journalists who will be here too. They're experts in their own right, and they're going to help move the conversations along. So I just want to say again, thank you very much for being here, whether you're here in the room or you're in some undisclosed location on your phone. We're looking forward to a great afternoon. I'd like to now introduce Mark Baumster, one of those Education Week journalists I mentioned. Mark is our deputy managing editor. He handles politics and policy for us. He ran our election coverage, and he was instrumental in building today's program for you. So have a great time. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon and welcome. And I am Mark Baumster. I'm Deputy Managing Editor here at Education Week and Government and Politics Editor, as Scott mentioned. And we really have a great afternoon, I think, of discussion and analysis, and really more than a little bit of, I think, crystal ball gazing that we're going to get into about the implications of the recent midterm elections. And we're going to turn our attention to the next window of opportunity over the course of the afternoon, the next policy opportunity building up to the year 2020, the next election year, which, believe it or not, is just about 13 months away, so the clock is already ticking. We're going to be hearing today from policy experts, from some advocates and Education Week journalists as well, and most important of all, as Scott mentioned, from teachers and other educators. These are the folks for whom these recent elections were more than just a political spectacle, and they were quite a political spectacle. But when it comes to education policy, the educators are the ones that the voters' choices are consequential for. It's something that they're going to be living with day to day. It's going to have real implications for the way that they do their jobs and carry out the mission of American public education, which is what this is all about. And with that, to not get in the way of the program, I would like to kick things off by introducing Maria Voles-Ferguson, Director of the Center on Education Policy here at George Washington University. She's a longtime education policy advocate and analyst, and she's going to give us the lay of the land on what these election results mean for education policy and the road heading forward into 2020. So please welcome Maria.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad you're here. I was just back in the green room with all of the teachers and educators who you're going to be hearing from later and their families, and you have a lot to look forward to. They are a very spirited bunch, so it should be very interesting. What I'm going to do is kind of set the table for what's going to come for the rest of the day. I'm going to talk sort of at the top level about the midterms and the impact of the midterms on some big education issues, just sort of give a very general lay of the land, and then throughout the rest of the day, the folks who are doing the other sessions will kind of fill in the other details of all of that sort of stuff. And I think we're going to have an opportunity for some questions in between me and Stephen Parker from NGA. So if you have some, be thinking. Okay. I like to think about what was happening before elections when I think about what happens after elections, to give some context and set the scene. So if we think about quickly what was happening before the midterm elections, we all know that there were a great many teacher strikes around the country. There was sort of this rising tide of teacher activism. A lot of people referred to 2018 as maybe the year of the teacher. So there was a lot of energy around teachers and what teachers want, and teacher pay and benefits and all that kind of stuff. Of course, we all know there were a lot of conversations and anxiety around school safety. The Parkland shootings and numerous other shootings in this country have made that a sort of major paramount issue before the midterm, certainly, and now after. All state ESSA plans were officially approved by the U.S. Department of Education, so that's something that we're going to be looking forward to now, looking in the future. Believe it or not, Congress actually passed one of the education bills. We refer to it as Perkins in the education world, but it was the bill that focuses on career and technical education. So we saw that passed. And now we have had ongoing, still before the midterms and after, ongoing conversations about the Higher Ed Act, which of course is the one that everyone's focusing on right now, and we'll talk in more detail certainly about that shortly. And in a related point, the various contretemps involving Secretary DeVos. A lot of this does have to do with higher ed. There's been a lot of difference of opinion, shall we say, about some of the issues related to higher ed. Efforts to repeal the gainful employment rule, how we manage for-profit colleges, and other issues related to higher ed are certainly going to come up in conversations moving forward now after the elections. So a very broad look at sort of the general issues that were at play before the midterms. So now the midterms happen, and we're sort of in the post-election chatter period. And there was a lot of conversation about the role of the educator candidate. This played well. The media kind of loved this, even though maybe the reality of it wasn't really as much as the media made it out to be. And we're giving a special shout out to Ed Week's Maddie Will, who I know is here somewhere, because she provided some clarity on numbers in terms of how many people actually really ran and how many people got elected. I was telling her earlier that I was trying to write a column at the time on this topic, and trying to get accurate numbers, I was ready to pull out my hair because some people had estimated 1,000 teachers had ran for office, and the numbers were all over the place. So I was very thankful for Maddie. If you're here, well done you, for giving us sort of an honest appraisal of what the real result was. And Ed Week estimated that 177 full-time educators ran, and of that group, 43 won. So you do the math, a lot more lost than won, which a lot of people made a big deal about. But when you think about it, to my last point, I think it's not just how many teachers won, but in which states they won and in which offices they're going to hold. That's really the sort of interesting point. The fact that a lot of them made it to the state legislatures is really interesting. I know from our own research at the Center on Education Policy, teachers often feel like they have a lack of a voice and that they're not connected to sort of power decision makers when it comes to education. Well, a lot of that does lie in the state legislatures. So if you have teachers in these positions and in other positions higher up the sort of education food chain, if you will, maybe we'll start to see some change in that regard. So I do think, even though it is a relatively modest number compared to the number that ran, it's important, and it'll be interesting to see if and how it makes a difference and where. Okay, so just interesting election tidbit highlights. A lot of you know all this sort of stuff, but let's just go over them quickly. So over 40 teachers joined the ranks of state legislators, and Democrats flipped 6 legislative chambers nationwide. Oklahoma, interesting, 66 educators ran, and 6 made it into the legislature. That's, to me, was interesting. In that sort of cognitive dissonance that really marked a lot of these elections about education, voters did actually not vote for the pro-education governor. So you saw some advances, there's pro-education advances in some areas, and not so much in others. And this was very true about funding initiatives. Tax increases were voted on in some states and then not voted on in other states. Some were struck from the ballot in some states. My colleague Matt Braun, who I think is here, made the interesting point that in all the states that had major teacher strikes, and the teachers were striking for more pay and better benefits, there were no initiatives to increase funding for education. So again, that sort of cognitive dissonance there of sort of showing sympathy for teachers, but not really moving in terms of action steps to actually provide more funding. In Kansas, a state that has seen some significant budget cuts, we saw a pro-education Democrat win, campaigning on this idea that we need to support education more. Wisconsin, Tony Evers, an educator, beats union buster, budget cutting Scott Walker. So for a lot of people, that was sort of like a very dramatic victory for Tony Evers. And in Arizona, we saw a voucher bill voted down, and Kristen Sinema wins the Senate race, a traditional progressive, but the pro-education governor was defeated. So again, a little bit of inconsistency. And then a topic that I find endlessly interesting, the amount of money that goes into state and local education races. Certainly California is the epicenter of this. And I just think this is such an interesting dynamic that has developed over the year for these locally controlled elections, and yet you have just millions and millions of outside dollars pouring into them. So I'm sure we haven't seen the end of that. So the wrap up here. I think there'll be a continued lack of coherence about what Americans want and expect from public education. We see a lot of different things in polling data. I know the 2018 PDK poll had some such interesting numbers in terms of the amount of people that felt that the teachers in their own community were not paid enough. I think that number was 63%, if I'm correct. And then the amount of people who said that they would support teachers in their own community striking for more pay, I think was 73%. So, a lot of support here for teachers. But the polling data around how to actually pay for those increases, whether it be tax increases or funding changes that push more money to less resourced students and communities, there's really not a sort of unanimous idea about how to go about doing that. So again, that'll to me will be an interesting thing to watch, how Americans support education in their actions and in their deeds. We know teachers matter to voters, we just don't know how much. And again, I think that's related to, to what I just said, is People really do seem to care about teachers. They get out and support teachers, but when it comes to actually turning that into some sort of voting action, it doesn't seem to always happen in the places we might expect it to. School safety will, of course, remain a top-of-mind issue. I think the continued activism that we're going to see from the Parkland students and others are going to keep this issue out there. There's also been dollars associated with it. I think over 260 states have funding measures for school safety on their, in the motion now. And of course, there's some federal money being devoted to this as well. So again, this is going to continue to be an issue. Also be interesting to see how that money is being spent and whether it's being spent well. It will be another story whether or not we'll have any evidence of that. Now with changes on the Hill, I think we all know we're going to probably see Congress starting to push back on some of the actions of the U.S. Department of Education. A lot of those will probably be in the area of higher ed. I do think that there'll be pushback about gainful employment and for-profit colleges and some other sort of incendiary issues that have really caused a bit of consternation with the House Democrats and the Secretary. So it'll be interesting to see. A lot of people have written some thoughtful stuff about this. There's been a bunch of really interesting analyses that all seem to point to the same direction, that now with some ability to sort of push back, it'll be interesting to see how much how the Secretary handles that kind of pushback, I guess is what I'm trying to diplomatically say. We'll see ESSA implementation begin in earnest. And again, a very rich topic for research. ESSA is markedly different than what came before it. So how states choose to implement their ESSA plans will be interesting and worthy of study in a lot of different areas. I know myself, I'm very, very curious about this to see how, and if the flexibility and freedoms that the states have, how they use those and where they see it as a value and where they see it as a challenge. So, so I look forward to reading all kinds of interesting stuff on that I know people will be following. And then finally, it's the cheeky point, I know, but should she stay or should she go? Everyone has got to start talking now about whether or not the Secretary will stay. It seems to be the thing that people do in Washington, but I actually make this point in all sincerity because I do think it's going to be really important to think about what this U.S. Department of Education is going to look like in a post-DeVos world. She has been a significant and impactful secretary in some ways, maybe not in an education policy reform way, so to speak, but the department has changed under her watch. And it'll be interesting to see what the department does in its next phase with its next level of leadership. For anyone who's ever worked there, and I myself have, you can't help but wonder when you're there, you know how it works, and you always wonder how the next team that comes in is going to manage things. So I think it'll be interesting to see who does step into that role. It's going to be a tough one, and what comes tomorrow for the department. I'm checking my clock, and I have some time, so I know it's still early on in the program, but if anyone wants to ask questions, I'm happy to take them. No worries. If not, we can move on because I know Stephen Parker is here from NGA, and he's going to talk to us about all kinds of nifty things as it relates to state leadership. And there's a mic there if you want to. No one wants to know how my Thanksgiving was? Seriously? I'm kidding. Okay, so I'm going to tell Matthew that we're going to move on, and we're good. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Will you be around for the break? Just leave that there.
Okay.
Will you be around for the break? Or will you be around?
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
So Maria will be around for the break as well, so if you do have questions, especially as the other content of the day evolves, I want to encourage you to have a conversation with her upstairs in the mezzanine. Now I want to welcome to the stage Stephen Parker, our guest speaker today, that will be joining Mark Bumster here. He's the Legislative Director of the National Governors Association, and they're going to take a view from the states with you for the next few minutes. Rebecca, could you set that clock back to 15? Thank you.
Wait for our counter to get set up.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. Well, welcome, Stephen. I'm really glad to have you here. And so we're going to talk state policy. So much political discussion gets focused inside the Beltway, on Capitol Hill, federal level, but really a lot of the action is at the state level. And there was an awful lot that went on in this midterm election that was really central to that. So I want to start off by asking a little bit about, as Maria mentioned, there's a lot of new governors that are coming into office. What is the learning curve really for a new governor who comes into office on education issues. And what has the National Governors Association done to kind of bring people up to speed on the things that they're going to have to be dealing with policy-wise?
Absolutely. So essentially, for those of you who are counting, we have at least 22 governors that we're expecting. We have races that still need to be sorted out in the Virgin Islands and the Northern Mariana Islands. But the good news is this. If you look at every single governor's candidate's top priority, whether they were running as an incumbent or whether they were running as a new candidate, education was a top priority for most of them. In fact, for all the new govs coming in, at least 19 of them we could find made education a top priority. And so as we think about what they need to do to get up to speed, the first thing is, you have to learn how to be governor. You have to learn how to manage, you have to learn how to hire your staff, and you have to make sure that you're ready to go on day one. And the things working against governors on day one are this. Most of them will take office after their General Assembly sessions or their state legislative sessions have already started. And the second thing going against them is that their state budgets that are likely being considered this year have probably been written by the governor that came before them, which means that they may not have full control. So what NGA has been doing is we've been giving them as many resources as possible. We had an overwhelming majority of new governors that came to Colorado last weekend, and the good news is it appears that they are up to the task. While education was the most mentioned word in gubernatorial campaigns in 2018, that the talk of education continued. The desire to do something positive on education continued, and we're hopeful that once they get hired up and once they start and get through all of the snowstorms and the things that they have to manage as soon as they get into office on day one, that they will hit the ground running on education.
When you mentioned what's top of mind, in the discussions at this new Governor's Academy training, what kind of education issues seemed to bubble up? When people did talk about it, what was top of mind for them?
So really it was just a general desire to do something on education. So the thing you need to know about new governors, and actually this seminar for new governors, Lamar Alexander, who's a former governor and former chair of NGA, he called this Baby Governor School. And so at Baby Governor School, we basically make sure that they are up to speed on how to hire their staffs and be governor and just know how to do the job from a management standpoint, and also to make sure that they're ready to address any disasters that come in on day one. We give them the tools they need to succeed, and in the coming months, we'll actually help them on specific education issues that they want to hit the ground running on.
Can you touch a little bit on really kind of the unfinished business or the agenda items that these governors are going to confront in terms of school funding and finance, school safety, which is something that Maria touched on, accountability, school quality and accountability under the Every Student Succeeds Act?
Absolutely. So in equal numbers, if you look at what commitments were made by the individuals who were elected to be governor, equal numbers, Republican and Democrat, actually agreed that something needed to be done on school finance. Where they disagreed was how to do it. And I think that's the biggest difference and the biggest dichotomy you're going to see as state legislative sessions get underway and governors take the oath of office is, while I think addressing funding in states is going to be the top issue that we again see this state legislative session and as a priority of governors' offices, you're going to see dramatically different proposals. And I think for those governors who will find it difficult to raise revenues in the state, I think those are going to be the ones that are going to face the most difficult decisions. State governments, because of the recession, are cut to the bone already. For most states, there is no place left to cut, which means that governors are going to have to get creative in how they come up with ways to compensate their teachers, and they're also going to have to get creative with what they're going to do to make sure that teachers are taken care of if they can't give them dramatic pay raises. One of the proposals that came out during the election was from current Congressman, future Governor of Colorado, Jared Polis. He believes that it's the state's role to start to provide affordable housing for teachers. And one of the campaign promises and proposals that he put out there is essentially the state partnering with local governments in high-need areas where it's hard to attract teachers to essentially provide housing for teachers. So if they can't give them a top salary, they can at least alleviate their rent.
Did school safety issues come up at all? I mean, this is certainly, as a result of the tragedies earlier this year, dominated a lot of state legislatures. There were dramatic proposals that took place in many different states.
School safety was a named top priority of 25 governors who ultimately won their elections, or 25 governors-elect. It became a campaign point because it was a point in real life. And so as we think about what to do about school safety, obviously when we've talked about disasters before and responding to disasters as new governors were coming in, we were talking about weather events. We were talking about different things like earthquakes and tornadoes that can happen. And now, because of this new era that we're in around protecting our schools. That is now an issue that governors have to consider on day one. So when we think about disasters, when we think about tragedies in states, a new picture is emerging when it comes to school safety. Now, as far as what governors can do about that when they come into office, I think there's a lot they can do on their own, but obviously as it being a controversial issue and being that it has died down a little bit, it'll be interesting to see if it's as top of mind this legislative session as it was the last. But I do think that there is a conversation here and another topic that we're going to be discussing nationally at the beginning of next year, which is infrastructure. As governors come in and think about public-private partnerships, as they think about what they're going to do on day one as governor to build bridges, build roads, build buildings, there's a lot to be said about investments that should be made in school infrastructure. But at the same time, as governors are representing themselves at the federal level, we need to talk about what flexibility will be there for states to spend any new federal infrastructure funds on school facilities.
To make the pivot to the feds just a little bit,
Sure.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the relationship that governors face and that states face with regard to the U.S. Department of Education. And there's going to be a learning curve here. These folks are going to have to get acquainted. Things are reset somewhat under the Every Student Succeeds Act. How is that going? What are the challenges for states essentially seizing some of this ESSA flexibility if it exists?
So I think there's two stories with the state-federal relationship on education right now. I think there's one on K-12 education, where you had secretaries of education before 2015 that had a fair amount of say over how K-12 education should be delivered in schools. And then Congress took away a fair amount of that say that the U.S. Department of Education and the Secretary of Education has had. And so when it comes to K-12 education, other than the approval of state plans, there has not been any interventions from the U.S. Department of Education or really any hand from the U.S. Department of Education since we've had the new administration. And that is not necessarily the worst thing when it comes to states, because states have been jump-starting their K-12 systems using the opportunity that is the Every Student Succeeds Act. So here's where there's a different story, and that is how this is going to play out as it comes to new leadership. We know at the local level that new leadership means change, and it's not always a good change at the local level when you have new superintendents, you have new principals coming in. At the state level, it's National Governors Association's job to make sure that governors are in the best position to make sure that this change in leadership is a positive thing, and it has as minimal disruption as possible. But that said, there are several tools that governors have at their disposal when it comes to the Every Student Succeeds Act. One is they now sign off on the state plan. And there is going to be a series of amendments that could be filed within governor's first few weeks in office at the U.S. Department of Education to either make minor changes to their plan and maybe even in some cases make wholesale major changes to their plan depending on the turnover in leadership. There's also another factor here that comes to the change in state education, K-12 education leadership. We have heard that there could be and have projected that there could be up to 20, probably over 20 new state education officials, state education agency, chief state school officers that will be in place in states. As new governors are coming in, at least 22, with up to 23 or 24 new state chiefs that could be coming in across the country, bridging that relationship and having a strong relationship with your chief state school officer is going to be the most critical thing when it comes to implementing ESSA. And also, the Department of Education needs to give governors and state chiefs as much time as possible to figure out what the new game plan is on ESSA, if it is new at all.
I wanted to ask about a couple of really concrete things.
Sure.
At the state level. As Maria mentioned, Congress, although this particular Congress may not have done a lot on education, they did pass a bill, Career Technical Education Bill. Now, career and technical education and workforce training is a very top-of-mind subject for governors. What action do you see on their part going forward?
Great. So 27 of the individuals who won their gubernatorial elections, whether incumbent or new candidates, made career and technical education a priority. It was listed on their website. It was something that they talked about regularly during the campaign. The career and technical education law that Congress just passed is a huge opportunity for new governors because I'm going to go back to the tool they have under ESSA. They sign off on the state plans. This is a new movement in federal education policy, giving governors the ability to have some say over what the state-federal relationship should look like in K-12. And so as we think about those plans coming together, and as we know that there is going to be less of a role for the U.S. Department of Education when it comes to the state plans versus what there was under the Every Student Succeeds Act, I think that this is an opportunity for states to come together, to not have to worry about the bureaucracy of getting a state plan approved and worry more about submitting something to the federal government and giving some sort of strategic plan to the local school districts to make career and technical education work. Granted, I think if for those 27 governors who were coming in who have made career and technical education a priority, we've told them one thing that's disappointing, and that is the Perkins Career and Technical Education funding that's coming in with this new law is about $1.2 billion. It's going to be a little bit more in next year. That's not enough to make major changes across the country in career and technical education. There is going to have to be a conversation between the governor and the state legislature about whether they want to prioritize this, and also whether they're going to work with some private businesses and try to bring in some private money and public-private partnerships and partnering with private businesses on coming up with new career and technical education models, not just in K-12, but also at the higher education space, using apprenticeships, using pre-apprenticeships. These are all tools that are at governors' disposals where, in some cases, they are less expensive than coming up with new classroom-focused career and technical education.
Now, we don't have a lot of time left, but I said before that we were going to do a little crystal ball gazing here.
Sure.
Looking forward to 2020, there's really kind of a window of opportunity for these governors to make some impact between now and then. What do you see happening in terms of traction between now and looking forward to the next reckoning, 2020?
So I'll start with what I hope for. I hope that governors ignore everything political that's going on in D.C. And I also hope that bipartisanship prevails. One of the most encouraging things we saw last weekend with all the new governors is, we don't have them for very long, but they were together for a period of 48 hours, new Republican governors, new Democratic governors. And by the time it was over, they were talking as though they were friends, and they've known each other for a long time. At the National Governors Association, it is our job to bring governors together at the national level, but it's also our job to bring governors together at the state level around state solutions. And so my hope is that governors, new governors, incumbent governors that won the re-election, they start to look at their neighbors and they see that even though they have a Democrat and Republican after their name and they may be of different parties, that they were running on the same things. They want the same things for their education system. They have the same goals. They want to make sure that there is enough funding for K-12 education. They want to make sure that college is more affordable. They all said the same things. They may have all had different ways of getting there, but as we saw with the class of governors that came in 2010, at least 32 new governors came in 2010. By the end of that 8-year period, governors were copying each other. Governors that ran on one thing and said that they were going to do basically address education in some way, and it was a very partisan way. They ended up looking to their Republican neighbor or their Democratic neighbor and doing it the way that they had done it in their state. The most notable example of that is free college, the College Promise campaign in Tennessee. We have a Republican governor who made community college as affordable as possible, in some cases free, and you have Democratic governors across the country, Republican governors across the country who look at what Bill Haslam has done in Tennessee and said, I want to do that. We need more examples of that across the country, and in order to do that, we need them to ignore the politics of this town.
Really interesting. We have, thank you. I think we have time for maybe a minute's worth of questions, if we have any questions from the audience. We have the microphone right here in the center that folks can come to.
Hi, my name is Ben Williams. I'm a teacher here in DC. I'm just curious, you had said that a lot of incoming governors are on board with making school funding a priority, but then you had mentioned that they're disagreeing on how to do that. Can you just kind of paint a general picture on how they're thinking about addressing school funding and what different options exist?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for what you do. Your job is a lot harder than mine. And second, it really just, it involves revenues or no revenues. That is the broad category, which is if you are a traditionally conservative governor and your state has not raised income taxes or has not raised sales taxes or has not raised any sort of revenues or fees in your state that produce revenues, that is going to be a challenge. If you are in a traditionally liberal state where there has not been a fear to raise taxes, it is easier to fill that gap. We saw in the state of Washington when their state Supreme Court started fining them quite a bit of money every day because they were not fully funding their education system under a constitution. It took a little while, but they were able to bridge that gap. In Washington, that's easy. In Kentucky, that's harder. Where we have to make sure that when we're helping governors kind of come up with solutions, it's going to be very hard to help them come up with things to do that don't cost any money. And so I think that's the challenge. In Arizona, you saw an example where you had a teacher funding shortage, you had a teacher salary crisis, you had teachers marching on the state capitol, and they actually started to raise revenues. I think you're going to have a lot more cases where if teachers are exerting pressure, if the education establishment is exerting pressure, and there is a public outcry for something to happen, that's when state legislators who have been traditionally fiscally conservative may have to look to this as an emergency and come up with some additional funding. So really it comes down to funding. And the funding options that governors laid out during the campaign and governors-elect laid out during the campaign that didn't cost any money are only a partial solution.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our audience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. We're looking forward now to introducing to you our next session. This is your chance to meet the educators. Teachers and other educators ran for office in record numbers this year, aiming to take their activism over pay and funding to the stage. Maddie, Will, Daryl, Burnett are going to bring out their panelists now. Please welcome 3 educators that are fresh off the campaign trail about what they heard from voters, how they fought to get their message across, and what lessons they learned that you should want to follow in, should you want to follow in their footsteps.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome, everybody.
I'm Madeline Will. I'm here with my colleague Daryl Burnett, and 3 educators who ran for a state legislature this year. They are part of a massive wave of teachers who ran for office at all levels. Education Week counted nearly 180 current classroom teachers who ran for their state legislature. And while just 43 of those teachers won, including 2 here, it was still a huge display of teacher activism that followed a season of strikes and walkouts. So before we get started with this conversation, we have an exclusive interview with Johanna Hayes, who is the 2016 National Teacher of the Year and who was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives.
I'm Johanna Hayes, and I am the representative-elect from Connecticut 5. I am the 2016 National Teacher of the Year and an educator. When I was on the campaign trail, a lot of my skills as a teacher came into play, and it really wasn't as much about the conversation surrounding education as people think, but it was about those skills of collaborating and working with different people and explaining ideals and critical thinking and all of those basic skill sets that are used for effective leadership. We saw around the country so many teachers walking out, going on strike. And as an educator, I know that that is the hardest decision a teacher ever has to make. And we saw that happening time and time again, where people are just concerned about the narrative surrounding our profession, about decisions that are being made in relation to our profession, with no teachers at the table, with no educators as part of the conversation. I think that Secretary DeVos, one of the things I am, a little disappointed about is that it seems like many of the decisions are made in isolation. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I think I know what you're trying to do, but by the time it gets to me, I need for you to understand what that looks like for kids. I need for you to understand how that will disproportionately impact the children in my communities. My campaign from beginning to end was less than 6 months from the moment I decided till the election. And I spent most of that time trying to assure myself that I was qualified to do this, that I had a voice, I had something to say. And what I realized every time I got in a situation or had to speak, I realized this is what we do every day. This is what teachers do, just in the geography is different, but we solve problems every day. We bring people together every day. We collaborate, we communicate, we evaluate the information and come up with solutions. And I think we have to give ourselves permission to do that outside of the classroom. And there is no blueprint for this.
Well, as Stephen from NGA mentioned before, states have had a very hard time raising revenue And boosting teacher pay can cost billions of dollars. But several candidates on the campaign trail, as Maddie and I witnessed, basically said, we're going to tackle this issue this next legislative session. So we have three great guests here today who came fresh off the campaign trail. Right next to me, we have John Waldron. He's a social studies teacher at Booker T. Washington High School, who in his second run for state office won a House seat in Oklahoma State Legislature. We have R. Travis Brenda, who's a math teacher at Rockcastle High School in Mount Vernon, Kentucky. He actually beat the majority leader, Jonathan Schell, in the Republican primary. And we have Amy Steele, who is a former principal of Beverly Hills Elementary School in Concord, North Carolina. She ran against an incumbent and lost by just a handful of votes. So let's start with you, John, and we'll ask all the candidates the same question. Tell us about your experience. Why did you run?
Well, as you said, this is my second race. I first ran in 2016, and I ran because, well, they made me mad. And they shouldn't have done that. You know, we put 25,000 people around the state capitol to protest for better education funding, and that same day, the Oklahoma State Senate cut the state income tax, further reducing the funding available for education. That was not going to stop unless we did something about it. So I filed first in 2015 and again in 2017 for this race in 2018.
You were telling me backstage you knocked on how many doors?
12,000 on this round.
Wow. Okay, so Mr. Brenda, why did you run? What was your experience like?
Well, originally, a lot of people thought I was just running because I was a teacher and the pensions were at the forefront. But for me, it actually started at a back-to-school prayer service, August of 2017. We always, the week before school starts, our pastor and his wife always call the kids down and pray over them. And then anyone that works in the school system, bring those down and pray. And our pastor's wife, when she got to me, she had a very specific prayer that I was the spiritual Esther and it was time to rise lest I perish, but if I perish, I perish. And there was a lot of confirmation after that. So even though education was an important part of the campaign, it really is what I feel like God has called me to. And God's opened the doors, and here I am.
Tell us about your opponent.
Mr. Schell was the floor majority leader. He, in the primary, spent just over, I think, $130,000 compared to my $15,000. And it was a really exciting experience.
Okay.
I think in the primary, the unofficial results on that night was I won by 123 votes. And then it's a primarily Republican district. There are somewhere over 22,000 Republicans, 10,000 Democrats, and 2,000 other. So I'd been told early on, even before I filed, that if Mr. Schell was going to be beat, he would have to be beat in the primary. There were some others in other districts that educator candidates that were running in the minority party, and they were not successful because of running in the minority party.
Well, Ms. Steele, you're a principal, which is sort of counter-narrative, and we did a story about principals running. It's a very unusual phenomenon, but why did you run? What was your experience like?
So I actually ran for office because, similar to John, you know, we had a situation where our state legislature created a K-12 class size mandate or K-3 class size mandate. And as an elementary principal, when, you know, my superintendent or assistant superintendent says, you know, this is what we need to do to comply with state law, then you have to manifest that in the classroom the best way you know how. And one of the ways we had to do that was really kind of pushing teachers out of certain classroom spaces in order to make space for other teachers and reduce the class sizes. Without any additional financial resources. And so that was kind of the tipping point for me, where we had to do that 1 year, and then the next year I received a call that said, you know, make room for 5 more teachers. And I said, well, at this point, I'm gonna have classes in the media center, the gymnasium, and the auditorium, which is the cafeteria, also known as the cafetorium. So what would you like for me to do? So, you know, those types of experiences really led me to start pointing the finger to other people saying, hey, you should run, you should run, you should run. And while I was pointing at them to tell them to run, other teachers and administrators, all of those other fingers were pointing back at me saying, why not you? Why not now? So that's why I chose to run, and it's been quite an exciting journey. Exciting is, it's a word filled with lots of emotion. I'm sure you can feel what I'm saying here, but it's come with a lot of lessons learned, a lot of information that we've had to gain and garner as a new candidate and as a first-time candidate. So, it was interesting, to say the least.
Okay.
So I'm curious to hear about what voters told you on the campaign trails. You're all from states that had walkouts, so I assume that education was fresh in their minds. So Amy, why don't we start with you? Like, what did you hear from voters?
So the number one issue in our area is affordable health care, or the lack thereof. So one of the main issues that spoke to me, or that I heard about, was always healthcare premiums, pre-existing conditions, and being denied coverage even though premiums were being paid. That was number one. Number two was affordable housing. We have an affordable housing crisis. Like nationwide, there's a book called Eviction, and that book really highlights the problem in our nation with affordable housing for people who have jobs but still cannot afford to live in the communities where they work. So that was the second issue. And then, of course, education was a top priority. I was actually the principal of a school that was facing being closed down because of funding and just a lot of different issues related to the infrastructure of the building, et cetera. And so I heard a lot about those types of things: neighborhood schools, the need to have smaller schools that are not so large that they really don't allow for the community that the neighbors wanted. So those were kind of the three top issues that we faced and that we heard from on the campaign trail. I remember one particular instance about affordable housing where I walked up to a home to knock on the door, and there were two people on the porch, and I said, "Well, is this your home?" And they said, "No, this is the home of a family member. We're waiting on him to get home." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "So do you live here?" And they said, "No, we're homeless." And I said, "Oh, okay." So, that is a real issue that we face in our nation. And, at that point, it's not about the vote, right? It's about taking care of their needs. And so as an educator, what do? I went into educator mode, call the resource, call here, call there, try to figure it out. But, those are kind of some of the things that we saw on the campaign trail.
So Travis, you, during the primary, your opponent had co-authored the pension reform bill. So was pensions a big topic for voters?
It was, and a lot of focus was on educators, but that pension reform bill affected all state employees. And I'm in a rural district, House District 71, where you're hard pressed to find somebody that does not have some connection to a state employee. And that was hitting a lot of families close to home. That pension bill was brought forth, and from introduction to passage was somewhere between 6 and 8 hours. They took a sewage bill, Senate Bill 151, stripped all the language out of it, and put the pension bill in a sewage bill. And that upset a lot of people. It's still before the Kentucky Supreme Court. It has been ruled unconstitutional by a lower court, and is expected, I think it's going to be overturned by the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. Some other issues that came up through the campaign, because of it being a rural district: job creation, building the infrastructure, having an education to prepare young people to be able to step into jobs and be able to perform on day one, but also being able to have people that can pass a drug test. The opioid epidemic is hitting a lot of people hard close to home. I have a lot of students, and I'm now in my 20th year of teaching, and in that time period, the number of students that are not being raised by their parents but someone else has skyrocketed. I had a student last year that is being raised by his great aunt, but he calls her mom because that's the only mom he's ever known. So all of those issues came about through the campaigning, and it's just things that I see every day in the classroom.
So, John, this was your second campaign, but of course this one was right after the walkout. So did you feel education was more on voters' mind than the last time?
Definitely. When I got to the point where I'd knock on your door and say, hey, I'm John Waldron, I'm a candidate for the State House, and I'm a public school teacher, and you already know why I'm at your door, don't you? And they would say, yeah, I do. I mean, I was a teacher and I ran on an education platform, but I think what we might all agree that the fundamental issue isn't education, it's democracy. We've had a lot of uncompetitive elections in the past, and we've had a lot of elections settled by primaries or by a candidate winning once and then serving 6 terms without ever being challenged again. And consequently, we've had a lot of bad politics in states like Oklahoma, where narrow interest groups get to drive the agenda, and then the effects are felt on public services like education, healthcare, roads, et cetera. So when I came out there, I would start a conversation about how important education is, but also how it relates to so much else. And I mean, as a candidate, you're really there to give the voters a voice. And that's why I knocked 12,000 doors. People hadn't had a candidate ever come to their door before. And that's the thing that's empowering and encouraging about this process. Yeah, I was an education candidate, but it goes far beyond that.
So you guys are all from states where there are walkouts. So why did teachers in your state walk out? Why not just work through the union and lobby during the regular legislative session? So John, let's start with you. You guys are in Tulsa. You guys walked 100 miles to Oklahoma City?
Some of us did, yeah.
All right.
What we learned from rallies and meetings and stuff is that you don't get what you want for your kids, for the people, by asking nicely. You've got to be a little bit more assertive than that. So we had a friend of mine did take on that walk. He walked from Tulsa to Oklahoma City over 7 days. We had snow, hail, and a minor earthquake along the way. Wow. And he walked that whole distance, and by the end of it, he was a candidate. He came as an ordinary protester, advocate, and he came out and he was a candidate. Asking nicely doesn't cut it when you have a legislature that's set on tax cuts or flat budgets at a time when your costs are rising and more students are coming into the system. So I learned from talking to the politicians that they would listen to you when you were strong and not until then. So my campaign was about making the cause of education strong again in Oklahoma City.
In Kentucky, the walkout that occurred back, I think it was in April or March, was not about increased funding for teachers. We were not asking for a pay raise. We were not asking for anything other than what we had been promised in our contractual agreement that's actually in Kentucky revised statutes. And they were looking at cutting benefits, the benefits that we were promised when we signed the contract saying that we were agreeing to teaching in the public sector at a lower rate than if we were working in the private sector. And I told people throughout the campaign, I do not see the retirement pay for state employees as retirement pay, but rather deferred compensation. That is, we're told during our jobs while we're educating or doing whatever, state police, social workers, whatever, we agree to work at a lower rate in exchange for being taken care of in our retirement years. And they were looking at cutting that. Later in the session, even though they said that they raised the primary funding for schools to $4,000 per student for the first time ever, it was an increase of about $18 per student over the previous biennium. While they were saying we're raising it here, they were cutting other areas, so actually school districts were going backwards. So that was the purpose of the walkout in Kentucky. The protest, there were estimates to be between 12 and 14,000 people at the Capitol on that one day that every school district in the state of Kentucky was closed. And my mom is a retired state worker. My sister teaches in the feeder middle school for the high school where I work. After school was canceled, we went up that day for that first protest, and we thought it was a huge crowd outside on the steps of the Capitol. But then when we walked inside and the whole halls were filled and it was standing room only, it was really powerful. As far as unions, in Kentucky we don't have unions per se. We do have the Kentucky Education Association, but it is just an association that helped. They were very instrumental in sharing the information with state employees And the labor unions also were very vocal in the opposition to that pension reform bill as well.
So, Ms. Steele, as district superintendents and principals were managing all these teachers walking out, you yourself got on a bus and protested too.
Yes, actually, so I actually drove, but I did protest. And there were tens of thousands, I think the estimates maybe came in at close to 100,000 teachers in North Carolina who were protesting in Raleigh. And so I was a member of that group because I felt a solidarity to the teachers. Back in 2008, as a teacher, a Spanish teacher in Concord, our salaries were frozen at, wherever they were, for whatever level, they were frozen. And they never caught up to inflation, but our General Assembly claimed that they still spent more on public education than any other legislature. So that was problematic because we knew the numbers and we were a part of the numbers and we were there when the salaries were frozen. So we protested for increased spending on education, increased professionalism and being treated like a professional in the field of education, but then also we protested against some of the mandates that were passed down without a viable way to make sure they were implemented, such as K-3 class size with no additional funding. So those are the things that we marched for, and so I give honor to all of those who marched that day. It was an incredible day, but it was essential to send a message because we are a non-union state. So similar to Kentucky, we have an association of educators called NCAE, and they did a phenomenal job of organizing the march. But it was essential to make sure teachers know that their voices can be heard and should be heard. I think for us as educators, for so many years, we are told and trained to be neutral and to not have a political opinion about anything and to not be political. So the march was a way to bring together Democrats, Republicans, independents, really anyone who cares about the efficacy of our profession and also the fact that we teach and educate children who are our #1 clients. So it was essential for me to be right there with my teachers and with the teachers from our county and from our state. And so as a result of that march, different groups spun off of that. And so now there are support groups on Facebook, on social media. There are teachers who gather within their respective counties. In our county, Cabarrus County, we have Cabarrus Teachers United. So it's so important for teachers to really raise up and understand that we all have a voice. But we're not going to get that voice heard by sitting by and playing nicely, similar to what he said. We have to engage in the action. So that's why I marched, and today is Wednesday, so Red for Ed, for all those who are supporting Red for Ed.
I should mention that Oklahoma is also, we have an Oklahoma Education Association, not a union, and maybe that's one of the reasons all three of us are on this stage.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
So, teachers were so fired up after the walkouts. So many filed to run for office. Most did not win. So I'm curious to hear your perspectives on what's next for the teacher activism movement. Do you see teachers continuing to be so engaged and to stand up and run for office again or walk out again? Or what do you see as next?
Well, I want to first be the first one to say that although I did not win, I learned so much. And as an educator, we are continuous lifelong learners. That's kind of the mantra of being an educator. And so you have to continue learning. But in addition to that, we have to continue showing all the little people that we won't give up in whatever capacity that is. So whether I run again or not, it is up to me to continue this advocacy and this work, and I think it is for all educators to do the same. So regardless of the outcomes, I think teachers are so resilient and have a certain amount of grit that they're going to continue going regardless of the outcomes, and they're going to continue to make sure their students are engaged in the civic process to further this education that we've gained by being on the campaign trail. I do want to say this, as Congresswoman-elect Hayes said, there is no blueprint for running for office. There's the Wellstone way, and there's this way and that way, and all of these materials and resources, but there is really no set way to run in your particular area for a local municipal race or for a state race or for a congressional race. There are all these prescribed, concepts like you should do this, you should knock doors. We made 40,000 voter contacts between calls, text messaging, and knocking doors. I knocked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of doors, well, thousands, but Anyway, you know, there's so many things that are contained within this process of running for office. And as educators, you know, we weren't really privy to that prior to running. We ran to be advocates. We ran to represent people. And then all of the other things happened. It's kind of like being a teacher. You go in to teach a subject and to work with children. And then you have all of these things that you have to do, and same thing as a principal. So I think once we kind of fine-tune some of those processes, we'll be even more successful in the future. But we must keep the work going in the in-between.
And I think Kentucky was similar. Most of the educators that were on the ballot were first-time candidates, including myself. For me, my campaign, the focus was the primary because of who my opponent was. And I'd been told early on that if he was going to be beaten, it would have to be in the primary. There were some that their main race was not until the general election. So there was a little bit of time for things to kind of cool down a little bit. Some of those other educator candidates were also running as write-in candidates, which is always difficult. But I think everyone that was involved learned a lot through the process and will be ready to come back the next time. As I've mentioned earlier today, I think I was running on the party that was the majority party in my district. There were some of those that were not running on the majority party, but were rather running on the minority party. And that's difficult. In my district, Republicans outnumber Democrats 2-1. And for those candidates that were running in those minority parties in their districts, that was difficult. But hopefully we've all learned. For myself, I had a lot of volunteers working behind the scenes from both Democrats and Republicans that were out helping knock on doors, sharing Facebook and Twitter posts, and just helping spread the word. And some of the information that I've gotten since the general election is there were some of the other candidates that were having trouble finding volunteers. There were 12,000 to 14,000 show up at the Capitol to protest, but not helping volunteer, and that's important. If you feel strongly about an issue, then find the candidate that aligns with that and help them out.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, in Tulsa, most of the teacher candidates lost, but we flipped a red seat. And we had a lot more competitive races in places we hadn't had before. So what happens next? Next, I think we set up a candidate school. The people who ran impart their experiences on others who might run. We recruit more candidates. We get more teachers to go out and do the organic work of knocking on doors and organizing that is more important, I think, than showing up at a rally. So do that too, please. You know, if you ran last time and you're willing to run again, well, let's start in 12 months, not 6 months before the election. Let's make sure there's adequate seed money for you to get started. If you're new to campaigning, we're going to help you understand your most basic functions, and we're going to help you get staff. And if you don't want to run, well, how would you like to be a volunteer coordinator? That's basically a professional texter. I have one in the house right now. You help get out the foot soldiers that make a campaign work. So we get organized. That's what teachers do. We learned a lot, we built a lot, and we're going to build on that in 2020 and 2022 and on, because this doesn't end, does it?
No.
I think we're going to start taking questions after my last question here, so if you want to start lining up at the mic here. So speaking politically, we have a new legislative session starting up in a couple of weeks. A lot of the demands that teachers asked for were not met. So what is your strategy going forward? We have 2 winners on the stage. You guys are going to go to your state capital. What is your political strategy?
Well, budget is a reflection of your values. You show me your budget and I'll tell you what you care about. So we're going to fight hard in the budget to make sure that we increase per pupil spending. We reduce class sizes, and we empower teachers better to be able to do their jobs. We've been doing the opposite of all of those things in recent years. As a member of the minority party, I'm going to spend a lot of my time trying to keep things from happening. And maybe some of you might have read in the Post this week that there's a county GOP organization that called for the abolition of public education and argued that that was not a proper function of government. Yeah. And so we have to fight that. And that means we have to get out a broader message. We have to fight every day in the legislature, and we have to open up the windows of the legislature and let people know what's going on. The work of campaigning didn't end just because we got into office. The people of District 77 need to know why I'm doing the things I'm doing, and we need to call attention to what special interests and elites are trying to do to the public services on which we all depend. So fight, fight, fight.
Similar thing, just have to keep staying focused and trying to build relationships with those that are there. Because as I've told other people, there are 100 legislators in the Kentucky House. I cannot do anything alone. It's going to take working with others, but as educators, we're used to stepping into the classroom every day, and whatever we face that day, we meet head on, and we do the best that we can at the time, and it'll be no different in the legislature. Work with those that are there, whether I agree with them or disagree with them. I told several people over the last few months that I believe there's a few on the extreme right and a few on the extreme left that are really vocal, but I think most people are more either right of center or left of center, and we should be able to sit down and come to an agreement and be able to say, okay, here's where I stand on that issue, where do you stand? Okay, let's compromise and meet somewhere in the middle and do what we can that's best for the people of Kentucky.
No, pensions is not an easy task to tackle. So what are your thoughts about how to fix a pension crisis in Kentucky?
Well, there were some major changes made in 2013, and with the economy improving, there have been some different studies that have shown that with those changes that were made 5 years ago, if it is funded the way it was supposed to be, that it's going to be okay, that it's making progress. There was a misconception throughout the campaigning that the pension systems, there are 8 different pension systems in Kentucky, that the misconception was that they had to be 100% fully funded. And that's not accurate. As long as they were somewhere between 70 and 80% funded, then it's considered viable. The only reason it would need to be 100% funded is if all of those benefits had to be paid out today. So we need to continue making sure that funding is there. Over 15 of the last 22 years, they were not properly funded. The recession of 2008 hit. That's why we are where we are now. It's not because of it's a broken system, but rather it was not funded the way it should have been. When Governor Paul Patton was in office, probably 10, 12 years ago, all of the state pension systems were funded at 125%. There was a need came up, he reached over and took some money and used it for a project. Every governor since then has done the same thing. So Governor Bevin has said that there's a hole in the bucket and it keeps draining out. The problem is the holes in the top of the bucket, people keep reaching in and grabbing. And so we need to put a lid on the bucket.
Yeah.
Okay. So Ms. Steele, you lost your race, but
Right.
I think you said you plan on running. And North Carolina has an interesting situation in which you have a Democratic governor, Republican legislature. What are teachers' priorities next year?
So for teachers, I think the priority is still on the same things, increasing funding. We're 39th in per pupil funding, 37th in teacher pay. We still have a lot of work to do. And so although I didn't win by vote count, I learned a lot. So I learned who I needed to connect with and how best to advocate, even if I'm not an elected official. There are still, alliances that I've built and worked with, various state officials who are elected and friends and colleagues along the way on the campaign trail who did win their races. And so I still have impact and ability to be able to influence some of those decisions. So I plan to just stay active and stay involved in the community, but also to make my voice known on the state level as an advocate, because essentially that's what I would have been doing had I been elected. So that's what I plan to continue to do.
Great. Well, we're going to start taking audience questions, so feel free to line up at the microphone. Sir.
Yes, I wanted to talk about the popular pension issue that's on. I just moved back from California, which several years ago voted an income tax increase, funding, local controlled funding formula, really to help low-income schools with a lot of low-income kids. And as it turned out, in places like Los Angeles, all the money went to pensions. Whether it's okay or not, I don't know, but it all went to pensions, and now the teachers are striking because they didn't get enough of it out of the salary part of it. And I just wonder if that's not a part of the discussion here, that in terms of public support for these activities, or even maybe how many teachers. My dad worked in a low-income school for 35 years, taught, but still I wonder about public understanding where people, like with their Congress members, they tend to support their own individual Congress members, but think Congress is doing a bad job. I think there's a lot of public feeling about that in education, and I wonder how to deal with that, where more money can actually go to helping the kids that are having the hardest time achieving performance in education, as opposed to funding the system itself.
Thank you.
Do you guys think that people have a clear understanding of school funding?
No, it's very confusing. Our incoming governor has said that since the teachers received a raise, they're now the second highest in the region, which I guess is true by some manner of calculation, but it doesn't feel like that when you're a teacher, and that's why we have 2,600 emergency certified teachers in Oklahoma. Incidentally, I think when governors make statements like that, it drives more teachers out of the state because it's an indication of where the governor's going to go as a leader. Yeah, the truth is we do spend a lot on teacher pensions. It's expensive, and you don't see that in the private sector anymore. So it erodes the support base for teachers getting those benefits. But teachers, we need people who are willing to dedicate a lifetime to education. You need career teachers, and we're watching that class erode and disappear in this country, certainly in states like Oklahoma. And the pensions and benefits have always been part of the social safety package that we've guaranteed educators for putting up with, no offense to your juvenile children, all these years. And I love them, and they're wonderful. I heard an education reformer say at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast once, we can't just keep cutting the budget to education, but we can't keep funding it the way we have and expect things to go on. And I wonder what that means. We're going to have to find a way to compensate teachers, and I'm a big supporter of Retired Educators Association, because if we take care of them, it's an indication that the system will take care of us, and therefore we should stay in the job. And when you apply a private sector model to it, well, public schools aren't private sector institutions. It's a social contract. And you have to be very careful when you meddle with that.
In Kentucky, I think it's important that everyone understand that teachers do have, I think it's around 12.5% taken out of our paychecks to go into our pension. We also have 1.75% taken out to pre-fund cost of living adjustments that we get back during our retirement years, but only at a rate of 1.5% cost of living adjustment each year. So we're having more withheld to receive that back at a lower rate. And I think it's important to communicate that with the general public that is not in education. But similar things for the other state employees as well. And I think communication is key there. There's been so long that the funding has not been put into the pension system, the 15 out of 22 years, that the state has benefited during that time because they've not had to revise the tax system that's pretty much been in place since I think around 1939. I think our society has changed a little bit in the last 80 years, slightly. And our tax system is similar. I know in Kentucky there has been a push to look at something as simple as revising the gas tax because of the increased fuel efficiency of vehicles and the hybrid vehicles. So we're not getting as much state dollars coming in because of less tax generated because of more fuel efficient vehicles. So there's a whole lot of things that have to go into that. It does not necessarily need to be looked at as an isolated case, but there's a lot of things that need to go together.
I'll yield.
All right.
Hi, I'm actually also from Education Week. My name's Elizabeth Rich. I'm the commentary editor. We are not the only ones that have been thinking about and writing about the sort of larger picture here. There were protests. This time it feels different. Mr. Waldron, you mentioned, we're angry. It's about democracy. I just wonder if you might speculate or tell us what you think is going on that makes this election year feel so different for teachers, particularly.
Well, it's either that teachers have reached a breaking point where they're no longer willing to put up with the things that have been put upon us, especially since 2008, and now we're coming back and fighting for a more civilized system, or it's a last stand. We're seeing public institutions breaking apart. We're seeing a loss of public confidence in institutions in our country. We're seeing a lack of voter participation, increased income inequality, and educators find themselves at the epicenter of all of this. So maybe what we're doing now is recalling the best elements of American democracy. We're getting up and seeing what's at risk, and now we're fighting to restore a system that needs to work better. Or we're watching the breakup of public schools and the social contracts that have existed before and the creation of some newer form. But I'm worried that that newer form is going to be a meaner form of living in this country, and we need and deserve better here in the 21st century. So I'm hopeful that the citizens of America will be behind us in the next battles. Everybody says they are when you come to the door. Will you be with us when it comes time to vote your values?
Yeah, I will definitely agree with John that, people we've just had enough. Enough is enough. And it's time to stand up for what we believe in, and it's time to make our voices heard. And I believe that teachers in Cabarrus County, in District 82 in North Carolina, are understanding that there's no union that's going to come and save us, that we have to save ourselves. So we have to continue to take that fight back to the political space and do what we can to overcome, especially for the people we serve.
Mm-hmm.
Loretta Goodwin, American Youth Policy Forum. Thanks very much for what you've shared so far. I was wondering about the impact on your students and what the example of you as teacher activists has set for those students, and what kind of conversations you had with your students as you were engaged in this process, and what you see down the road for this kind of activism, what it means for student engagement.
Oh, sorry, that's okay. So I've been a K-12 Spanish teacher, but most recently was the principal of an elementary school. And so when I first announced my candidacy in December of 2017 and started to make my students aware, and parents and community members, some of the students, they didn't have quite a full understanding of what it meant to run for state house. And so they asked if I was running for president, if I was, running for, mayor, and is it like that, Miss Steele? What is it like? What do you mean? So the understanding and the education process of just K-5 students is immense, and it's quite fun and exciting. They wanted to help, they wanted to volunteer. Some of my students made campaign donations, and to help out because they thought Miss Steele needed some money, and we did, right? So that was fun and exciting, but I think just them seeing that I was willing to follow after the calling that was on my life was the lesson. That was the beginning of the lesson. And then to show them along the way what that looks like, the resilience, the grit, the determination that you need to run for office, it spoke volumes to them. I'm a mother of 5 with kids ranging from age 7 to 18. And so my own children were able to witness this, and all of my kids attend public school. And so they were able to witness it, but not only that, they were able to witness what do people say about their mommy when they go to school. So basically, what do parents say around their kids about other candidates running for office? And so that was interesting because they had to create a sense of advocacy. And then the most special thing happened where some of my high school students, where I taught Spanish, they were coming back to be volunteers on the campaign, to knock doors, to speak and lead the Latino initiatives in Spanish for some of our Spanish voters who spoke Spanish. And so that was really exciting to see all of them engaged where they fit. I had one young lady, 2 actually, step up, and they were in their 20s, whom, I taught. They were in my school, right? And they said, we want to help with social media and these types of things. So allowing students to serve where they fit was, that was probably the best series of moments on the campaign trail. And, I learned some of the issues that were important to them, student loans and the possibility of having them forever like a child, having their needs met in terms of affordable housing and healthcare and some of their parents' concerns. So it was essential to have students working right next to me, with me on this campaign trail, so.
No, I had students that were excited, and it was exciting to me to see the excitement that these students had. Students, in all my years of teaching, I had never seen such excitement for politics, and for, if nothing else, for them to take an interest in the world around them in a way that they had never done before. It was really exciting to me. Also seeing some of those Facebook posts and tweets about, I got to vote for the first time and I got to vote for Mr. Brenda today. It's pretty special.
That is. In Oklahoma, we had a 2-week, work stoppage, which extended the school year. And I think that was a little distressing to some of the seniors, and they followed with a 2-week work stoppage of their own when we got back. But I think teachers, our tendency is to, when we're asked to do more with less, we do more with less. And the students got used to seeing us get beat up a lot. And I think young people appreciated watching us stand and fight back. I think a lot of people learned lessons from that. And I was honored to have students of mine and former students work on my campaign. I have one here today. And that was really encouraging and inspiring. And it really also informed my freshman government unit on local campaigns and elections. The young people needed to see that teachers are agents, not just a piece of the system, but that they can be the change they wish to see in the world. Yes. And maybe kids can too. So I think that was one of the outcomes of this whole series that we're going to see go on into the future.
Good afternoon. Thanks first and foremost for your commitment as educators and for your courage running for office. My name is Julie Kirk. I'm with the National Association for College Admission Counseling. Thus, my question relates to school counselors. I'm curious to hear how you all see similarities between some of the challenges that school counselors and teachers face in your school, and maybe how some of those similarities may have presented themselves in your campaigns, and perhaps how you may plan to incorporate some of those similarities as you take office in your state house.
Well, we really need to empower school counselors. Once their job was to counsel students, and now they administer standardized tests all too often. They've been given so many burdens by a system that didn't provide additional resources for it, that things like traditional counseling, taking care of the well-being of the students and helping them get into college are falling by the wayside. And I think you've also seen, colleges have seen that the incoming group of No Child Left Behind educated students are good at answering questions, but not good at coming up with questions. They can master and marshal facts, but have we been giving them enough opportunities to think for themselves? So if we go back to the question of counselors, I mean, they're faced with the same pay scale as teachers and other issues like that, but only half of this is about material issues. The other half is about whether we're empowering educators, and that includes counselors, to do their job and fulfill the potential of these kids. The kids are really the most important resource that you have in the classroom. They can tell you what it is you need to do for them, and our system ought to let us, including counselors, do that. So we have to pay for good public schools. We have to make sure teaching is a profession people can raise a family on. But we should also go back to the business of making our schools and our teachers and our school employees centers of empowerment and not just pieces of bureaucratic cogs in a wheel.
So I want to answer that question as well, because being on the campaign trail, I worked with counselors. So for 7 months, I was actually still actively a principal. And one of the things that I noticed is that, counselors face an immense amount of pressure to still meet the demands of the job and the national counseling requirements, and then also take care of the needs of the students from a mental health perspective, as we see so many social issues manifest in the classroom and in the school, and then also meet the need to be the standardized test givers and organizers and things like that. So I think, as John said, we have to continue to empower all educators, from psychologists to school nurses to counselors to teachers, teachers' assistants, custodians, everyone, as they need to advocate for their positions. But also, we just have to realize we are facing a crisis that we've never seen before, where so many students are facing mental health issues. Counselors are essential to the fabric of our schools. And right now in North Carolina, they're allocated somewhere between 1 to 500 or just under 500 or 1 to 600. It's really ridiculous. And so the local LEA is responsible for making sure that they allocate even more counselors per pupil. And so they can pay to have extra counselors to reduce that ratio. But it's impossible, in my opinion, for a counselor to serve 500 students adequately and meet their needs. So we all have to continue to advocate for those students and for those counselors.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name's Cheryl Gibbs Binkley, and I am on the strategy team for the Badass Teachers Association, a national group, by the way, and for Virginia Educators United, which is working on momentum in Virginia right now for a similar grassroots movement to what you guys have already been participating in. My question for you is, what you kind of answered some of that in your answer to the last question, which is we've experienced a pretty ghastly reform movement for the last 15 to 20 years that has been progressively becoming more destructive and onerous to our beloved schools, and people are now refusing to cooperate with that anymore. But what then do you see as the next iteration, not at the upper policy levels, but in your schools, on the ground? How is this going to change how we're able to educate our students in our individual communities and schools?
Maybe you should go first.
Well, in Kentucky, I feel like there's been a push to move toward charter schools, which in essence will be taking money from the public schools and putting those teachers with less resources than we have now, even though there have been cuts. When adjusted for inflation, the funding for the next biennium falls behind the dollar figures for 2008, 2009. So there's going to have to be additional funding. There's going to have to be an increase, just because by staying the same with inflation, we continue to fall further behind. So that there's going to have to be something looked at with that to increase that funding at the school level.
And to that effect, I think we need to allow teachers to do what they do best, and that's to solve problems. And so teachers, educators need to come together and be a part of the conversation around what are the flaws in the way education funding is currently, or education system is currently funded, and how can we attack it and correct it and fix it. I think teachers are more than capable of coming together and doing that, but we have to be given the opportunity, and at this point, we just have to take it. So take your state budgets and look at them and literally try to solve the problem. In STEM education, we focus on problem-based learning all the time. We give the students a real-world problem, and we ask them to go through a series of steps in order to solve the problem. That contains merit and value with teaching critical thinking skills and making sure we involve those who are impacted by whatever the decision is in the process of solving the issue. So that's one step critically that I think we need to take.
Well, I think we're out of time, but please join me in thanking our great guests.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, guys. Maddie, Daryl, and their guests will be around for the afternoon break right after our keynote conversation with Wade Henderson, past president of the Leadership Council on Civil and Human Rights. If you would now, please welcome to the stage Wade Henderson, Dean Michael Foyer, and the Deputy Managing Editor of Education Week, Mark Bumster.
Okay. Excuse me.
I thank you. And I would like to, once again, to welcome Wade Henderson, who is the past president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and a former Washington Bureau Director of the NAACP. He'll be joining me and Dean Foyer for a discussion of this panel's topic, which is educational equity, equality, and opportunity going forward. So welcome, Wade and
Thank
Michael. I'd like to start out this conversation by asking each of you really to kind of set the context for us in which we as a society should be talking about these issues of educational equity and inequality in our public schools. There's a lot of different lenses that we can put on this. What's the starting point of the discussion? Do we want to talk about economics? Do we want to talk about segregation and resegregation? Talk about political polarization? Some combination of all of these things. And I'll start with you, Wade.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Honored to be here. Great question. I think, truthfully, you start talking about all of those issues simultaneously. I begin an analysis like this with that great quote from William Faulkner that the past is never dead. It's not even past. And the truth is, you can see that in everyday circumstances. So let me give you 3 quick ones. The 14th Amendment is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. Birthright citizenship, which was the foundation predicate for the discussion of the 14th Amendment, is the issue of the day with regard to immigrants and whether there needs to be a change in that policy. Secondly, we just had the election of a senator from Mississippi last night, state with the highest concentration of African-American voters in the country. This is a woman who proudly proclaims her affiliation with a racially segregated academy from which she is a high school graduate. But more importantly, her daughter graduated from a racially segregated academy. The third example I would cite is the Pittsburgh shooting at the Tree of Life Temple. It was the most prominent anti-Semitic act in the history of this country and reflects an increase in 17% in hate crime activity over the last year. Was the crime committed by Islamic terrorists, quote unquote? Absolutely not. It was a reflection of homegrown terrorism, conditions of which are being exacerbated by the political debate of today. So that's the context in which I think we have to have a discussion about equal educational opportunity. I think there's some slides that you are posting.
Yes, we have some slide here that really shows us in a very big picture way some of the demographic context for the makeup of the nation's school system, the 51 million schools students, and the racial breakdown, and also some information about the percentage of students who are in poverty as measured by eligibility for a free and reduced price lunch.
Well, you've done a great job with that, and I want to acknowledge also a young woman by the name of Francesca Simon at the Leadership Conference who helped research some of this for me as well. She's terrific on this. And these statistics are useful. But let me say, guys, those are generalized statistics that belie what's happening at the local level. And if you really want to get a sense of what's going on, I encourage you to read some of the complaints that have been filed in the cases that are mentioned on one of the slides, which talk specifically about the equity suits around the country. I'm going to cite one in particular, and that's a case that was filed earlier this year in New Jersey, in Mercer County, which is the home county of Trenton, New Jersey, the capital of the state, by a group of civil rights advocates. It's the Latino Action Network, the NAACP of New Jersey, and others, versus the state of New Jersey. And they are challenging an equity or an inequitable educational situation. But here's the deal that's so fascinating. When you focus on what's going on, you have 3 cities, just as an example, Camden, Newark, and Patterson. They have 68 public schools. Collectively, they educate about 30,000 students or over. The majority of those schools have a 0 to 1%, 0 to 1% white population. Now, why is that significant? Because concentrated race, concentrated poverty, and segregated schools continue to be a proxy for the kind of investment our communities are prepared to make. And there is structural inequality that, unless we begin to address it, will never respond to the problem that these schools represent. In Trenton, which is the capital of the state of New Jersey, which you see, by the way, mentioned in Hamilton. It's a wonderful production, and they talk about Washington's first conquest in Trenton. Trenton has an 89.1% poverty rate in its over 11,000 public school students. And yet we send teachers there who are barely experienced, who are very enthusiastic, obviously. They want to do good work. But the truth is they're ill-prepared to deal with the problems that a city like Trenton or Camden or Patterson or Newark show for their students. So if you're looking for the first responders to poverty in our country, they're teachers. They're teachers. And when we don't prepare adequately to address the problems of concentrated poverty and racial segregation, then you have a problem. So last point, Mark, and I'm done. This is I'm into these anniversaries, guys. This is the 62nd anniversary of something called the Southern Manifesto. It was the constitutional statement of principles issued by 101 members of Congress, 19 senators, 82 members of the House, the entire delegations of Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, in response to the Brown versus the Board of Education, pledging to use all, quote, lawful means to block the integration of public schools. And whether the Southern Manifesto is still, operative today, which is not, it nonetheless casts a shadow on what's going on vis-a-vis states' rights in schools. So in the absence of some sort of sweeping federal constitutional right to education, which the court considered once in San Antonio versus Rodriguez, a 5-4 decision, which ruled that education is not a constitutional right, until we tackle that issue or deal with the circumstances that reinforce the poverty that we've talked about here, then we're not being serious, guys, about public education. You have residential segregation, and New Jersey is a good example. Residential segregation established by law, school districts that are built contiguous to racially segregated communities, and state legislation which requires that students be assigned based on their geographic location. Charter schools in New Jersey draw from the school systems in which they were created. So they are highly concentrated, segregated schools in New Jersey. And the states that are now most segregated are no longer states in the South, those delegations that signed the manifesto. They are states in the North, New York, New Jersey, and others. So, if I seem a bit pissed, it's because I am. The truth is, guys, this is not rocket science. But we continue to deny the reality of structural inequality coupled with racism, coupled with an unwillingness to fund education in the way in which it needs to be done. And that will change, but it will change only when external pressures force it to change, which means the litigation that's been filed in states across the country, we need to lift up those litigators. They are doing a terrific job in reminding us of our obligation to the students under our charge. And then lastly, we're going to have to figure out as a nation, given the demographic change which is likely to occur, which is occurring, guys, whether the projections of our country no longer having majority population in 2040 or 2050, whether that comes true or not. The expansion of populations in the African American, Latino community, and the need for an educated workforce will require employers and others to invest more aggressively in funding and trying to equalize educational opportunity. So there, thank you.
Thank you, Wade. And you drilled down very deeply into many of these sort of the racial segregation components of what we're looking at, and showed the convergence with economic factors. And I wanted to turn it to Michael a little bit, because to ask you to unpack a little bit more for us, really kind of the, as you mentioned, Wade, sort of the structural nature of this inequality, and what's the economic piece of that? And you've got a couple of slides.
Before you put the slides up, let me just preface this, first of all, by saying thank you to Wade for being part of this with us.
Thank you, Mike.
I've been stalking this man for decades, and you should all know that he's one of the great heroes of the civil rights movement in our community and in our country. So thank you for being here, Wade. It's a real honor for all of us.
Thanks. Please. Thank you.
In my spare time, I'm occasionally a very amateur baker, and I have gotten even more sensitive to the power of recipes. So I was thinking about the combination of the way our system was designed with two fundamental ingredients: political fragmentation, 50 states, independent 15,000 school districts, et cetera, and the economic ingredient, which is funding of public education through property taxes. And I put those two together, fragmentation and financing, and that for me is a recipe for disparity. So we shouldn't be actually quite so surprised when we then confront the data about the extent, the depth, and the persistence of some of these disparities. On the other hand, and I am, as a recovering economist, I'm always on one hand and the other hand. On the other hand, there is stunning evidence of the commitment of this same new republic that established this system of fragmentation and financing to the concept of public education. Compulsory schooling was essentially invented in the United States. If you look at the data on where we were compared to many other countries in terms of participation in schooling, and even with respect to the inclusion and the invitation to participate in this system to so many people and such a diverse population, with one, of course, glaring, horrible, tragic exception, which was the African American community that wasn't invited to the party until way too late, until the 1950s, and we're still catching up with that, as we all know. But when you think about all of those trends, the amazing thing is that we have come as far as we have in the embrace of the ideal of public education and the expansion of the franchise. And when you listen to those teachers and educators and the principal here, and she said something about whether she was going to run for president. I didn't catch that exactly, but if she decides to run for president, I'm going to sign up and be her campaign manager. Anyway, when you think about the inspiring voices of the people who go into the schools every day and are trying to continue to fill and fulfill that dream of what public education was supposed to be about here, that gives me a little bit grounds for optimism. On the other hand, we know, and now you can look at this data, if you think about something like the explosion in income inequality that we have allowed to take place in this country essentially over the last 30, 40 years. Look, we always tolerated some inequality. That goes with the fragmentation and all the rest. But the explosion in inequality that we have allowed to take place in this country since approximately the mid-1970s is absolutely stunning to anyone who is paying attention to the history and to the future of what this country is supposed to be all about. So this is, you know, I'm sort of basically at times a data guy. And here you have, just to put this into context, where we are in terms of inequality with respect to other countries, and where we are in terms of poverty with respect to other countries. This thing called Gini is an economist's tool that we use to measure income inequality, wealth inequality primarily. And the US is maybe not #1 in the world in math and science, but we are getting close to being #1 in the world in inequality, which is really quite a disaster. With respect to poverty, the fact that we now have somewhere in the zone of 22 to 24% of our children living and surviving below the poverty line? This is what the American dream is supposed to be about? No. Next slide. This is, again, a kind of good news, bad news story with respect to data. In spite of everything that I just said, we have made significant progress in the reduction of the achievement gap between black and white Americans. Now, that's good news. Two pieces of bad news. First, in spite of that progress, we have also allowed the gap to explode with respect to the affluent versus the less affluent. That's what that picture is about. The other bit of bad news is that people are interpreting this modest reduction in the black-white achievement gap as a case for saying, oh, good, the race problem is solved. Well, good morning. It is way not solved, and one should not overinterpret from the evidence of some progress that we can now become complacent and drop all of the attention that we need to be focusing on exactly that problem of race in America. Last slide is, again, evidence of the effects of this income inequality. This is a picture of resources that families have available to invest in supplementary activities for their children. Always a gap. Again, this is part of the American scene. But the way the gap has exploded, so that today you have this enormous difference in the capacity of parents who have limited income with respect to what they can invest in their children's supplementary activities, including little things, by the way, like test preparation. So if you're wondering why college admissions is as complicated as it is in part because we have enabled the more affluent to have access to the resources to give their kids yet another advantage in getting into the most elite and selective schools. I put all that together, and you want an answer to the context question? I'm reminded of what Oliver Hardy once said to Stan Laurel. He looked around and said, well, we've made a fine mess of things, haven't we?
So,
oh my.
So let me, wow, so you framed the issues pretty starkly for us here. And I guess what I would want to ask is, what's to be done essentially to raise all of this to the level of public consciousness where effective action gets taken to remedy some of these?
No, I think that is one of the central issues. Let me also make a quick observation and I agree, Michael, with the wonderful slides in your presentation. Guys, I think to look at public education as a, quote, public education issue misstates the true nature of the problem. Public education and the questions of public education are also a question about fair housing. So when you look at the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, and one of the problems that we're seeing now are the end of court-supervised integration efforts at the state level. They've been supervising these cases for years, and they're backing away from that. And they have said to us that school segregation is, in large measure, a fair housing problem. The fact that you have concentrated poverty in communities that were set up by state action to restrict on the basis of race and then build school systems around those very communities guarantees that you're going to have the kind of inequality that exists in very dramatic ways. Right now, there is a regulation that the Department of Housing and Urban Development is required to implement. It's referred to as affirmatively furthering fair housing. It's an effort to promote fair housing in communities and in community development. It's being resisted by HUD. It's being resisted. Now, that resistance means that the effort of local activists to try to address the quality of public education available to students is simply not going to be as successful as it might. So I think that that's one of the challenges. Now, answering your question, Mark, what do you do? How do you bring these issues to the attention of the public? I think the business community is actually in a position to drive a lot of change here, guys. There are a set of skills that are needed for the new economy, which we are not producing a sufficient number of students that are really trained in those skills to address the problem. And you hear it constantly from the business community around the country. We're going to have to find ways to dig deeply. You know, you talked about STEM programs, that's obvious. But trying to provide students, for example, with preschool activity, pre-K activity that strengthens their capacity to learn, to help socialize students to the rights and mores of public education is really important. Recognizing that in the absence of truly equitable public education, the challenge of affirmative action is going to be on the table. Now, if you assume that there is genetic, distribution equality, that, the so-called bell curve analysis is not accurate, and I don't think it is, then I think that the kind of imbalance that you see in the performance of students, which seems to be correlated around race, is really correlated around opportunity. And that in truth, if you offered the kind of rich environment that students who do well and succeed in higher education also have in the K through 12 space, then the chances of getting a broader distribution of high-level performance is increased. I think businesses are driving that. And I think, look, I don't assume malice in the population as a whole. Personally, guys, I'm very optimistic. I mean, I grew up in DC, right? I grew up in DC. I grew up in a segregated world. I was fortunate to be a part of the change that I hope to see come. I succeeded beyond my own expectations. And the truth is, that exposure tells me that the people I've encountered hold no inherent malice per se. I think this country affords opportunity in a meaningful way. But you've got to structure how you deliver those opportunities, et cetera.
So a question for the both of you. So where do you see the rumbles of change? I mean, you've diagnosed the issues here.
Yeah.
What do you see bubbling under the surface that's going to take action? What's happening? Rather than just to say that this is what it is, and it's going to remain the same, do you see glimpses of areas where the issues are being addressed in a fundamental way?
Well, I want to pick up on Wade's reaffirmation of his optimism. And I also have sort of, I like to think of myself as a somewhat congenital optimist. I must say that it's getting harder these days. Anybody who doubts the effects of environment on genes, I can tell you that my so-called congenital optimism is suffering from the environment these days. Leaving that aside, I think there is a basis for optimism if one is willing to accept one of the great sort of the peculiarities of the American system, which is a reliance on local, innovative, and grassroots engagement and involvement. Now, I don't want to push this too far because, for me, states' rights has as much to do with states' wrongs. So I don't want to get too far into the business of the fragmentation. On the other hand, evidence that we have from communities that are working hard to overcome some of these huge challenges and obstacles that are the result of big macro-level economic shifts, all kinds of other trends in our economy and demography. At the local level, there is evidence of progress. And I will mention some examples later. So I used the idea of a recipe. So I'm thinking of a new recipe here, which has to do with a combination of smart thinking about the ways in which in localities, citizens can get together and actually rework what's happening and make progress, because I think A, that will help them, and B, the news will spread and others will pick up on ideas that are being developed by those in their places. And you think about those teachers and principals who are running for office that we heard before, this is partly the message, at least for me. The second part of the recipe is that we as sort of policy wonks, educators, scholars, researchers, and the like, need to be thinking about the standards of evidence that we apply before we accept the possibility of making some changes. And whenever you come up with someone who says, well, no, we can't do that because we don't have conclusive evidence that it will work always for everyone and forever, that's a recipe for stagnation and nothingness. And therefore, this combination of allowing some innovative spirit at the local level and recognizing that at times one has to act even based on somewhat limited evidence, as long as there's enough to give you a sense that it's worth trying, that for me is a possibility that we can really make some positive change.
Where do you see change knocking on the door?
Yeah, I share Mike's optimism, but I will say, guys, look, I'm a lawyer, I'm an activist. I'm putting a lot of my money on the lawyers. And what I mean by that is that when they litigate cases, they bring issues to the surface and force policymakers to deal with them. I look at the Kansas litigation, which has been incredibly successful. I want to give them credit. I look at the suit that was filed in, I think, '96 in Connecticut, Sheff versus O'Neill. One of the lawyers is now the acting dean up at UDC Law School, John Britton. You know, one of the solutions that came out of that case was magnet schools. You know, I look at the lawsuit in New Jersey, as I mentioned earlier, and one of the solutions they're pushing is to build for the state to invest in the creation of magnet schools. It's not a panacea, but it affords opportunities to bring students together, irrespective of their race, because there are incentives that the state builds into the school that makes them attractive. And that kind of diversity is absolutely essential for the America of the 21st century. And I believe that those lawsuits are a part of a solution. Now, I also have a lot of respect for legislators, both at the state and federal level, that see their responsibility as more engaged to really work with public education. I look at the incoming chair of the House Education and Labor Committee, Bobby Scott from Virginia, as offering the kind of legislative promise that's encouraging. I look at Patty Murray and Lamar Alexander, you know, at the Every Student Succeeds Act. Look, it's not a perfect bill, I got that. But they afforded a level of bipartisanship that is critical if we're going to move forward. You know, Patty Murray obviously brings a lot of experience to the table. She's a teacher, she knows, and knows the policy issues up and down. Lamar Alexander, people don't know Lamar Alexander very well. He's from Tennessee. And by the way, when I mentioned the Southern Manifesto, there were 3 senators who refused to sign.
Oh, God.
Al Gore Sr., Estes Kefauver, both Republicans from Tennessee, and Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson refused to sign and became the president who advanced civil and human rights in a significant way. So I look at, you know, the reality of what's happening, and I see these legislators as being important. Lamar Alexander clerked for John Minor Wisdom, who was one of the great Fifth Circuit judges who helped change the landscape of civil rights in this country. The fact that he chose Lamar Alexander as one of his student clerks says something about his character. And that has been the experience that I've had in dealing with him. So I'm saying to you, look, I think from an institutional standpoint, the system of state and locally controlled public education has not proven to be equitable because there is not an equitable level of political power among those communities that are most directly affected. And until you can change that, you can't change the political landscape that controls these decisions. Litigation is one tool, and people of decency is another, and the business community collaborating to press for change. I see all of those as factors in pushing for change at the local level. And in Washington, there are NGOs that are really very actively involved. I mentioned the one I was affiliated with, the Leadership Conference. It's a coalition of national organizations. Great respect for them. And I think that you have to look to the NGO community as part of the solution. And then lastly, I would just say you have a slide that you may show about student loan debt.
Yeah, and I wanted to pivot just a little bit
Yeah.
and talk and to ask very specifically about the higher education component to this.
Yeah.
This is something that you've been working on recently.
Something I've been working on, because the truth is K through 12 and PK through 12 doesn't really answer the question, guys. I mean, graduating students with a high school diploma and nothing else does not promise the level of engagement in the economic life of the country that it used to. Just doesn't guarantee it. So unless you have some postgraduate high school graduation analysis, it's very hard. And I'm not suggesting that every student needs to go to college. But I do think that community colleges are important elements, and I think four-year colleges are important elements. And I think schools that offer legitimate trade practices are important elements. I have a real concern about for-profit schools and the way in which they are being implemented. I have a concern about four-year schools that generate a level of student debt that is something that becomes a crisis hidden in plain sight. I mean, I know too many young people who are carrying house note-sized student loan debt that really prevents them from pursuing the kind of life that we defined during my generation. They don't buy houses when they're young because they can't afford to. They can't afford to have a family carrying that kind of loan debt. And unless we begin looking at that crisis in a direct and earnest way, it won't happen. I'm working now with an organization called the Center for Responsible Lending, and that's where these stats came from. And they are really concentrating on, among other things, student loan debt. Because they were very much involved in the payday lending fight and the mortgage scams of the last decade. They see student loan debt as the next big thing facing the country. And I think they're right about that. So I see higher education as being a very critically important issue that should be the subject of conversation. But until we get K through 12 correct in terms of how we fund it, the quality of education available to all students, the level of equity that is built inherent in the system, I think that the discussion about higher education will continue to be on the margins.
Now, Michael, I wanted to ask you a little bit, just specifically as a teacher educator, what is the responsibility of the teaching community to address these issues, and what's the responsibility of the universities that train teachers to step in and to move in this direction?
Right. Well, we do spend a lot of our time worrying about those questions here at GW and in other universities. I would just add one footnote to Wade's comment about student debt, and that is it is unquestionably a problem and an issue that we all need to be paying attention to. But I would caution us not to allow the student debt issue to become an excuse for people who rhetorically and otherwise are trying to dismantle our whole system of higher education anyway. There are a lot of things about American higher education which are magnificent, and this problem of debt is one that we've got to deal with because it has been growing. But on the list of things to really focus on, I wouldn't want the debt problem to become one that is more fuel to the flames of people saying higher education is too expensive, doesn't pay off, and ought to be completely dismantled. Way too fast moving on that.
So
a lot of the problem of higher education has less to do with debt, I think, than it has to do with the abdication of the states in their responsibility to continue treating higher education as a public good. And to the extent that we've had one of the most remarkable systems of public higher education, and by that I would even include the private institutions that had benefited from the various kinds of federal and other state financial aid systems and all the rest, that has been a remarkable achievement. And now the fact that so many of our large public institutions are themselves competing for resources in the ways that require them to be focused much more on tuition, which leads to a debt. And anyway, you see where I'm going on this.
So
as far as teacher educators, yes. Yeah. So there is a bit of a tendency whenever there's a huge social problem that is identified to say, aha, it must be the fault of the schools. And in fact, the teachers that we know and work with are the real heroes in this whole system, because they go to work every day, and the vast majority of them are doing exquisite work in circumstances that the rest of us sitting in a very beautiful auditorium here don't usually have to grapple with. So point number one is just to keep in perspective that one of the other problems with the way the whole system is structured or understructured is that these heroes of the system are actually not being either compensated or appreciated and respected to the degree that they should be, number one.
So very quickly, if
Yeah.
you can give us a couple of, because I want to be able to squeeze in some Q&A here.
Sure.
Give us a couple of examples of what you think is working, that actually is working in this arena.
Okay, so that's great, because you know, when it comes to looking for a basis for some optimism and some continuity here, I'll mention 2 or 3 real quick, and then people should look these up and see for yourselves that these are things that really have been demonstrated to work. The Boston Public Schools have a full-day pre-kindergarten program in just about every one of their elementary schools, and the track record on this is evidence-informed, researched to the up and down the wazoo, and is demonstrating real progress in the improvement of literacy, numeracy, and other things that are valued in education. Second example, Mississippi's on our mind today. I would recommend, just in general, that you all read this book by Jim and Debbie Fallows called Our Towns. Actually, Jim Fallows was our guest the last time we were doing this event. They traveled across America and descended on small towns that are usually just the flyover towns that most of us, at least I had never been to. One of their stops was in Mississippi, where they had the occasion to visit a place called the Mississippi School for Mathematics and Science. Look this up. The kids arrive with a portfolio, without a portfolio of science genius, but they learn fast. In 2015, one of its alumni was chosen as the first African-American woman Rhodes Scholar from Mississippi. Evidence of the capacity of an institution with the right resources and the right will to really make a difference. Third example is right here in DC. If you look at some place like the Langley Elementary School, and I mention this because the principal is one of our alumni from GW. Her name is Vanessa Drum-Canepa, and she has an innovative program there in socio-emotional learning that has resulted in a dramatic reduction, among other things, in the suspension rate. Is that the whole answer to public education? Certainly not, but it makes a difference. It's moving in the right direction. Truesdale Education Campus, another school in the District of Columbia.
Absolutely.
Not exactly the easiest place to imagine education reform. The principal, Marianne Stinson, the assistant principal, Michael Redmond, both currently getting their doctoral degrees here. Coincidentally, I thought I'd mention that. Are closing the opportunity gap in that community. Read up on Michael's book club, where he has young black boys reading African-American authors and other literature that is giving them a new sense of identity, belonging, hope, opportunity, and progress. And sure enough, their reading level at that school has gone up from 20% on grade level to almost 90% on grade level. Progress is possible with the right kind of preparation, support, and what's the word I'm looking for here? Tenacity. You can't give up on this stuff.
Interesting examples and plenty to look up on. We have a couple of people here for question and answers, so please go ahead.
I'm Gregory Prince, formerly a high school teacher, college professor, college president, now working with a not-for-profit. One question I have for all of you is I haven't heard much talk about the students in terms of their agency in this process. Ms. Steele, I was quite excited about the story she told about students being involved. Mr. Henderson, one that I spend almost every week in Newark, New Jersey. The magnets are working. The charters are working. 70% of the students are going to the comprehensives. Perceive themselves as going to the leftover bins because they're not in the magnets. They didn't get in the lotteries. Not a choice system, it's a lottery system. We work with those students in the comprehensives, and they perform just as well as the magnets and the comprehensives if they're given the kind of socio-emotional support. It's not, they don't have to have a lot of classes. It isn't a question of the curriculum. It's a question of having people tell them that they can do it, believe in them, and support them. So I would like to hear more about what you would do.
No, I think your question, your point is really well taken. I went to law school in Newark, and I'm very active in a couple of Newark institutions, one of which is Rutgers Newark campus. Nancy Cantor is the chancellor there, and she's doing an outstanding job. And the engagement of the college with the community really helps lay the foundation for the kind of change that you've talked about. And I also have found that, you get engagement from unlikely players. Paul Fishman, who was the U.S. attorney up in Newark, was very active when he was the U.S. attorney. He's now on the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice Board, and that NGO is part of the litigation team bringing a lawsuit against the state of New Jersey, along with Rutgers faculty and others. So I'm very optimistic about Newark and the kinds of programs that Michael mentioned, and they can be accomplished at the local level. But your initial point about the agency of students is really so well taken. What I have found is that when you really deal openly with students, and I speak at a summer program for student leaders around the country that Bank of America operates, which I think is terrific. And I see this incredibly diverse group of students. And when they talk about their concerns, they do so in a way which blows my mind. They are so focused and functioning at a high level. And what I find is that students have many of the answers that we seek and how to improve the quality of education that they have available to them, but often we don't listen, or we don't take their advice and counsel as seriously as it deserves to be taken. So I think that has to be a very important part of any discussion about the future of public education. I'm glad you raised it.
I'd like to squeeze in a couple more questions really quickly.
My name is Morgan Brill. I'm currently a student at GSHED, and I also work at Widmeyer Communications. And this is a question that I'm pulling from Professor Glazer's class, so my cohort who are here will know what I'm talking about, but and kind of know that I'm cheating a little bit. But I'd love to speak a little bit about the roles that charter schools play in this climate. Do they increase equity or exacerbate inequality? We know that in certain environments they raise test scores, but they also might make it harder for traditional schools to pay fixed costs. They exacerbate, to some extent, the segregation that Wade mentioned. And just by and large, not every student can go to a charter school. So I guess, to me at least, it seems like we're at a crossroads. And I guess my question is, where do we go from here?
Well, this is, again, just, since I'm an evidence guy, this is evidence of the great capacity of the George Washington University School of Education, because we have students who are asking these really tough questions.
Yes, they are.
Okay, but I'm going to try to answer this just real quickly. On the business of charters, this is a terrific example of the attempt to find some balance between the potential for innovation and progress that can happen when institutional rules are somehow changed, relaxed, or modified, versus, again, the downside risk that by allowing that kind of a system to proliferate, we may actually end up perpetuating and making even worse the kind of inequities that essentially we were starting out to try to solve. And as you know, because you're studying this stuff, the evidence is mixed. But let's not ever forget that the people who advocate for the wholesale marketization and privatization of American education are not putting the possibility of increased segregation and inequity at a level that it warrants in terms of figuring out whether all of that is really what we want to do. Does any of that make sense?
No, it does. Can I just add one thing? I'm so sorry.
Everybody here is voting. We're going to stay here for the rest of the afternoon figuring all this
very
stuff
quickly.
out.
Look, it's great. I don't disagree at all with Michael's observation, but I would say this. There are problems that are below the surface that need to be examined. You know, when you cream students from public education and you take them into charter schools, you doom the public education to deal with some of the most hardcore circumstances of poverty that exist. Is that really what we want to do? Let's lift up, by the way, the teachers in West Virginia and Kentucky and Arizona and others who raised hell about the lack of funding for students and public schools. Were it not for those teachers, it would have been almost impossible to get aid in those schools, but for their strikes. So I'm just saying, guys, generalizations are important.
In general.
In general, right? But look beneath the surface and see if we can do that. Sir.
30 seconds for our question, and then...
And then 5 minutes for each answer?
Yes.
Yeah,
There we go.
given that I have so much time, I'll start with the lighthearted topic of structural inequality. But no, so to your point, I was really inspired by a lot of what you both said, but Mr. Henderson, with the lifting up the litigators in really using the legal system to be able to tackle school funding inequities, what do you see as the strategy or some of the strategy to be able to force the hand of legislators that are refusing to act in making sure that the systems are more equitably funded?
That's a great question. First of all, I think great question. Most of the litigation that is likely to succeed will be done at the state level, not at the federal level. Obviously, the courts are changing. It's unlikely that we're going to see, a positive outcome at the federal level. I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's going to be a problem. So state litigation is going to be key. And using the contradictions inherent in state constitutions that promise a quality public education to every student on the one hand, but fail to deliver that, as my friend Michael says, there's evidence to support that, and using those contradictions to force the court to grapple with the inequity that exists. That was the strategy that was used by Charles Hamilton Houston at Howard Law School with Thurgood Marshall and others to use the contradictions of the existing system, the difference between what you say and what you do under the Constitution as a way of helping to advance that, and being persistent. When victory after victory was established in the courts in Kansas, the state legislature resisted implementing solutions. And these litigators would not take no for an answer. They went back and they fought. So I have a lot of respect for those who are litigating the issues, and as someone who has been an advocate and lobbyist at the federal level, that litigation opens up opportunities to negotiate meaningful solutions to some of the problems that exist around equity. And until, the need for improvements because of the changing demographics and the changing needs of the workforce catch up with the diversity that exists now, you're going to have short-term solutions based on litigation and advocacy, and it's got to be coordinated, and it's got to be targeted, and it's got to be strategic. And what I'm finding is that these activists who are out here now are very strategic, very thoughtful. I give them a lot of credit. They're pulling on the past, but they're also looking to the future. They're charting their own course for how to bring about change, and they're doing so in conjunction with other groups that have other responsibilities. Voting expansion is a big part of that. So I look at Florida that just had a referendum that now has empowered 1.5 million individuals who were excluded from voting because of criminal convictions in Florida, who will now be voting from 2020 onward. Now, is it going to make a difference at the outset? I hope so. But they're going to have to be organized and educated and brought into the system. That's a longer-term effort. So it's those kinds of grassroots engagements that I'm thinking of that will help in moving it forward.
Thank you very much.
And I just want to leave you with one final observation. No, hold on. I know. I see the zeros flashing. We're going to take it out in the hallway. Just one point about the role of states in all of this that I'd love to leave you with this observation. It turns out that the National Governors Association, and you heard from Stephen Parker earlier, National Governors Association today, the chair is a Democrat from a red state, that's Governor Bullock of Montana, and the co-chair is a Republican from a blue state, that's Larry Hogan from Maryland. And if you think about the combined power of an organization such as the National Governors Association, and the idea that these guys are finding ways to solve real problems and tackle these big issues, I add that to my new and improved recipe for optimism about the future of the American system.
Thank you very much, Wade.
Thank you,
and
guys.
Michael.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you all.
We were wondering basically if educators were getting more questions from their students about where they stand politically, how political polarization affected their relationships with their colleagues. So instead of just calling a bunch of teachers, we actually put out a survey into the field with the help of the Education Week Research Center to get to the bottom of some of those questions. So I'll just give you a quick recap on what we found. And generally speaking, educators told us they didn't think it was their role to discuss politics with their students. But more than half said that they didn't avoid political activities just because of their jobs. They were still willing to go out there and canvass and do all of that. And while the majority of educators were Democrats, which is sort of the stereotype, and they did support Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, their views really didn't line up in neat partisan boxes. For instance, even Republican educators are skeptical of school choice, especially vouchers. And many Democrats had reservations about the impact of immigration on K-12 schools, or don't feel super comfortable with transgender students using the bathroom of their gender identity, even though that was an idea, pushed by the Obama administration. Since then, we've actually done a couple of other surveys. This summer, we talked to principals about civics education, and they told us they didn't think there was nearly enough civics education in schools. And we surveyed first-time voters about a few months ago, and they said that they were more likely to go to the polls if they'd had some sort of a standalone civics class in school. About 60% of them said that they were likely to vote in the midterm election, but only about half could name a candidate on the ballots. That was pretty interesting. So what has our polarized landscape meant for K-12 schools and the people who work in them? And what, if anything, can educators do to help bridge the political divides? So with us to unpack these questions, we've got a great panel of educators, including some folks who were part of the survey. We have a superintendent, a principal, and a teacher, and they all at some point have been named Superintendent of the Year, Principal of the Year, or Teacher of the Year. So we've got a really distinguished group up here. Jean Collins is the superintendent of the Rutland Northeast Supervisory Union District in Vermont. Dennis Barger is the principal of Vail Academy and high school in Tucson, Arizona. And Topher Kandick teaches English language arts at E.L. Haynes Public Charter School here in the district, and he is a GW alum who was District of Columbia Teacher of the Year. So these folks on the panel, we chose them because they all have different political views, but this is not Crossfire K-12. We're not, none of that, sorry. Instead, we're gonna have a collegial discussion about some of the issues that educators deal with in the classroom and their school districts. So without further ado, let's get started. So in general, getting back to one of the main questions that was part of our survey, do you guys feel comfortable sharing your personal political views with your students, and why or why not? What do you think is basically the appropriate role for educators on this point?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I think as an educator, it's really important that we are teaching our kids critical thinking skills. And so generally, I would say no, an educator should not share their personal views unless it's in the context of a critical thinking discussion dialogue where all opinions and views are out on the table and being discussed. But I think it's really important that educators not force their views on the students that they're teaching. Kids need to learn to critically think on their own.
All right, thank you.
Actually, we have board policy that says we're not allowed to do that.
Okay.
But before I went into administration, I was a high school social studies teacher, so I taught mostly junior U.S. history and senior government. So within that class, you can't really have a conversation and be honest with kids and shape it without sharing with them where you stand politically. So I would let my students know so that they can understand the biases that I would speak to those issues with, and challenge them to have conversation with me, and they don't have to agree with me, and I don't have to agree with them, to listen and learn from each other and see how you get further into topics that way. But as a administrator, I expect my government teacher to do that with students, but I wouldn't expect my freshman English teacher to do the same.
Okay.
For me, I think it's important to, as a teacher, before any teaching, and I'm an English teacher in high school, before any teaching happens, to establish an authentic relationship with my students. So it's hard for me to do that if a student is asking me about myself, to be authentic and not engage in those issues. And I understand the issue about telling students what to think, but sharing your views, in my opinion, is different than telling them what to think about political views. So I'm as open as I can be, and I have noticed in the last few years students being a lot more engaged in wanting to ask that question, which seemed almost taboo when like 10 years ago when I started teaching. So it's an interesting finding, and I don't have a problem sharing my views, and I think it leads into these discussions that are critical thinking and really help students process in their own way.
So how has the current political climate affected your interactions with colleagues who might be kind of on the other side of the aisle?
The morning after the 2016 election, I came into the office, and a couple of employees in my office were very upset because another employee came in and had voted for Hillary Clinton and was quite upset that she had lost. So there was immediate tension and conflict right within the adults that were happening. And that I've seen that also play out in the schools. This election in particular, I think more than any other, really did create more polarization within the adults within our system.
And how have you dealt with that as a superintendent?
I'm kind of still with where Topher was talking about talking with kids. I think that I have intentionally focused on ensuring that conversations remain civil and safe and open, and have had conversations with adults either as a faculty or as an office or individually about the importance of respecting other people's opinions.
Yeah.
I think, and I don't think I've had to do that around politics before in my 30 years in the industry, having that intentional a conversation with adults.
Yeah. What about you, Dennis?
Well, I'm very fortunate to work in a school district that has a really clear statement. It's our ACT statement, and that is we are respectful and trustworthy, we care about each other, and we take responsibility. And that leads our conversations with kids when they make bad decisions in school and we have to call them into our office. It also leads our conversation in how we handle parents who come onto campus who might be unhappy about something that's happened, and in our interactions with each other. I mean, we talk about doing the hard work of getting along, because we have to model for students what that looks like. They can turn on the news and see what uncivil discourse looks like any given time.
Yeah.
But we need to be the ones who model what that looks like. And it's okay that you don't agree on everything. We don't all have to see things the same, but we want to afford each other the courtesy of listening and then making an informed opinion, because maybe somebody has information about something that you don't know, and that changes everything. And as educators, we're in the business of learning and growing, and so it's a great opportunity to model that for our students.
And I'd just echo what Dennis says, but add, in DC, there is a pretty monolithic voting bloc, so there's not a lot of, I don't encounter a lot of people who are vocally against the views that I have. That's just the way DC kind of partisanship is in the schools. But I think it's really important to remember the modeling issue, because even when you're not teaching in front of students, students are watching you and they're learning from you. So part of our job as teachers becomes to kind of inhabit that discourse that we want them to use when they're older. So I think it's really important, not just in the classroom to be modeling, which I think is something that'll come up later when we're talking about this, but also outside the classroom when they see that you have differences in whatever opinions or views, and be civil about it.
So what about within the classroom? Have you found yourself dealing with politically divisive issues among your students, and how has the climate impacted how your kids relate to each other?
We definitely have. We had some students who at a basketball game wanted to kneel during the anthem, and the high school principal was supportive of them, of their ability to express themselves respectfully. But then the next day we had another student come into the school wearing a Confederate flag as a cape. And so, that changed all the dynamics and caused a great deal of discussion within the school. But that's the kind of newer discussions that we're having to have as a result of the divisiveness of the nation right now.
Surprisingly, I haven't had as much of that going on as I would have anticipated, given the cultural climate today. But again, you know, we're pretty out in front about communicating expectations. Like prior to the elections, you know, getting on there, hey, tomorrow we're going to have a new president. I remember making this announcement. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. But we're all going to come back to school tomorrow, and we're all Vail Academy and High School boxers. We're all Americans, and we're going to be respectful about whether our candidate was the winner or the loser. And in a nation that is a democracy, that person holds that position for a number of years, and then we move on and we continue to do that. So this is not the end of anything or the beginning of something. It's just a continuation. So we just had that conversation with kids, and we didn't really have much of an impact the next day.
I have an entirely different experience. The day after the 2016 election, I was teaching at a school in Southeast Washington, which is 100% African American, and we were doing a writing program with a bilingual school uptown that was primarily Latino. And so the next day the mood was just off. And when we went to go up to this other school, the younger writers that my class was mentoring, I think they were in 2nd or 3rd grade. Those kids were terrified. And because a lot of them, their families were immigrants, they knew immigrants, and there was no solid information about what was going to happen to them. Yeah. And it was really scary for them. And that emotion really resonated with my students, who were, I would say, pretty apolitical going into it and pretty confident that the outcome was going to be that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency. So that morning, they cried together with the young kids who were writing, and it really hit me that, like, it's important to kind of not just to prepare them, but to get them into a position where they understand what's going on around them, because it didn't feel good as an educator to have so much kind of fear and emotion going on the day after an election. So that was my experience, and kind of after that, since then, I feel like that I've seen a lot more students involved in asking questions and being and trying to become involved politically.
Yeah. So about half the respondents in our survey voted for Hillary Clinton, and about a third voted for Trump. And I'm wondering, what do you guys think of the job that Trump is doing so far on education? If you voted for him, would you vote for him again? And if you didn't vote for him, would you oppose him again, or has he convinced you?
The big question of the day.
Yeah.
I voted not for him.
Okay.
And I would not vote for him again. I feel as though the nation's administration right now is really setting education back 200 years. We have worked very hard to build a very inclusive public school education system that serves every child, no matter where they're coming from. We don't even ask them their immigration status, actually. We don't get to pick and choose who our kids are or what problems they might come into the school with. We are inclusive. We build opportunities for kids to be inclusive with each other, to build a democracy, to build the ability to learn from and work alongside people who are different from each other. And I think the current administration is completely undoing that, both through their own actions as well as policies that are being discussed or even passed at the moment. And I'm very concerned about that.
Okay.
Well, I would start by saying I ran for office in 2016 myself as a Republican, and so I got asked this question all the time: do you support President Trump or candidate Trump? And I didn't like either of the candidates on the presidential ticket in 2016, to be honest. I would really struggle to vote for our current president again, because I think the administration has not really done a good job of setting leadership examples. I think that's probably the biggest issue. There's just a void of leadership in the White House. And I, as someone who's a leader of an organization every day, the decisions I make and the way I choose to treat people every day set a tone for children who are watching everything we do, and parents as well. I mean, a lot of educators say we serve children, and I think we serve parents.
Yeah.
Those are our constituents. They're the ones who buy houses in our area and pay the bills and elect our governing board, who then hires a superintendent who hires us. And so we have to model good behavior all the time. And so we walk that very fine line of encouraging parents to get involved and be role models for their children. At the same time, we can't tell parents what to do because ultimately we work for them. So it's a very fine line.
So you voted for him kind of as the lesser of two evils, but you're not sure.
I used that very phrase. Yes, I did.
But you're not sure if you will again.
I couldn't.
You couldn't again?
No.
Okay.
I'm just curious on like, have things changed, or is it just the kind of the realization of who the president is right now?
Oh, it was primarily an economic decision. I thought who would do a better job running the economy, and so that's why I went with our current president.
I didn't vote for Trump. I wouldn't vote for him again. I find it hard to use him as an example of someone who's presidential when talking to students. And I think tone matters a lot, and modeling matters a lot. And what I see coming from the White House, what I see coming from the Department of Education is not it's not the tone that I would like my students to have. And one thing that I think is really important, just to get back to the idea of being authentic, is I think we want our classrooms to kind of run as authentically and as kind of democratically as they can. And when the leadership at the top level of democracy is doing things that we wouldn't want our kids to do, there's something backwards about that. And that's not why you vote for the president, but that's part of it. And when speaking to kids, it's hard to justify bullying from the White House when you're asking your kids not to bully each other or being nice or any number of things. So it's very for me, it's really concerning, and I'm looking forward to leading the fight against him in 2020.
Oh, okay. So
that's not I'm not running for office for president. There's not an announcement in front of the audience here, but.
I guess you get a good vote from the GW alumni.
Yeah,
anyway.
the GW bump, I mean, it's famous.
Yeah, that GW voting block. Most of the educators that we surveyed were opposed to school vouchers, even if they were Republicans, which obviously that's an issue that President Trump and Betsy DeVos have been very passionate about. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that educators are against private school vouchers, even if they believe in many other Republican principles? And where do you personally stand on that?
I don't support school vouchers. I don't, again, for what I said earlier, I believe that public schools serve everybody, and vouchers segregate the population. So with school vouchers, it's usually people with means who access the vouchers, and you don't have a balanced school system. And I think it's undemocratic to have a segregated school system.
On paper, I like the idea of vouchers.
Yeah, I hear you.
Because it gives parents real choice. Right? Some parents they live where they can afford to live, and as we've been hearing all day long, the neighborhoods in or the schools in neighborhoods that are lower income tend to be less successful, as measured by the data points that we all use across the country. So to empower those parents with choice would be helpful. However, like you said, Jean, they are generally taken advantage of by the wealthier. The problem for me is that with those vouchers going to private schools, there is no requirement of special education. There is no state labeling system or accountability measure that we have to do. If those two pieces were added in and those schools that took vouchers had to provide special education at the rate that public education does, and they had to be assessed the same way that public schools do, and they could do it better, then why would we be opposed to that? Maybe we would learn something. I don't think that would be the case. And in Arizona, vouchers were made illegal several years ago. There was a court decision, so our legislature, in their very creative way, decided to create empowerment scholarships and give that money directly to parents, and then parents can decide where to get their kid educated. And then there was an initiative, and it was just defeated 63-37, which is a pretty loud margin. The voters in Arizona said, no, this issue needs to go away. So we've actually gone to the polls twice and had our state Supreme Court say no to vouchers and empowerment scholarships. So unless those other provisions are put in there, then I am opposed to it.
Okay.
And just to add, like, I'm not sure of any, maybe y'all know too, but like, I don't know of any research that is not unbiased that says vouchers work. And like you said, on paper, it might be a good idea, but in schools, we're not dealing with paper in schools. We're dealing with, like kids' lives, and that's too valuable to be like testing political theories on without the research behind it. I think it just seems like a bad idea.
I'd like to comment if I could on,
Sure, absolutely.
on kind of going through one person at a time. I have all these great ideas. If I didn't go first, I could say them later.
You take all my good ideas, so
Yeah,
going
can we
last
switch
is
places?
tough, too.
You can go first on the next question.
Anyway, what I wanted to come back and visit is as I'm listening to you, Dennis, what I'm hearing is that choice is a good idea, and I agree with that. And Vermont also does not have vouchers, and I was able to create 2 magnet schools within my system that allowed for public school choice. We have a high school public school choice within the state of Vermont, and then inter-district elementary school choice I was able to create in Burlington, and actually I was able to create it in the district I'm in now as well. So I think choice is good. I think choice is actually really good for education, which has been stagnant for too long. My concern with vouchers, and I guess I was responding thinking private school vouchers.
That was my,
is it is siphoning money away from all kids in an inequitable manner, because I think there are many kids who cannot access, even if they can access a voucher and go to a private school, they can't necessarily participate in it fully because they don't have the means or the transportation or the support at home to be able to do so. And again, the segregation occurs. And the third point I would add to yours is often it's a lack of certification as well. So there's a different quality of teaching, and I believe that public school teachers who have gone through significant education to get to where they were are excellent at what they do. And I'm concerned when, I'm not saying that every private school teacher hasn't gone through that, but private schools generally don't expect the same level of certification as public schools do.
Yeah.
So can I just,
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
Arizona, we had about 1,800 teacher openings at the start of the year, several consecutive, so classrooms without teachers.
Yeah.
So we have already lowered the bar in Arizona as to who can become a teacher. So we are almost at, individual districts may say we're going to have everyone certified, but it's no longer a state requirement. So our bar is essentially you have to have a college degree, that's good, and you have to go through a program, but you can come in and teach without any coursework or without student teaching. So yeah, we're already there.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, so similar topic on choice, and I'm going to ask Topher this question first, so that he doesn't take his good answer. The majority of teachers we surveyed, even Republicans, are opposed to charter schools. You teach at a charter school, so I'm guessing you have a different take on this. What do you think? Why do you think that even Republican teachers don't love the idea of charter schools? And what are your own personal views as, well, you're a charter school teacher, so.
Well, I'm not going to try to get in the head of a Republican, so
Yeah,
we can,
Dennis can explain,
ask an expert. But for me, I think this is okay, so when I graduated from GW, I wanted to teach in a public school. And I interviewed around, and the only job I got was in a charter school.
Okay.
So I went to a charter school. Talk about economic need. So that was my choice, was to go where I was offered a job.
Makes sense.
If I was kind of being stubborn and just wanted to stay in a public school, might not be up here right now. So that's where my job is. But I think for this issue, this is an adult issue, and I think we can take a key from kids, because kids aren't asking each other, do you go to a charter school or do you go to a traditional public school? They're just hanging out as kids. And for me, it makes sense to go to a good school, but it doesn't make sense to say, and Dennis's school has been both, right? Has been a charter and regular. So to me, it's a silly game if you're in the same school and it's getting switched around from above you. So my stance has softened since I started working in charter schools. And I think we do some good work, and I think we're filling in some gaps that needed to be filled in DC.
Okay.
So Arizona, about 15% of students in public schools are in charter schools. So we, I think percentage-wise, have more than any other state. California's close. So it's been a big movement in Arizona for the last 20 years, charter schools, a little over 20 years. I think that they serve the choice thing that I've already mentioned. that provides that. But we have charter schools that are at the real high, kind of peeling off the 98 and 99th percentile schools, and we have charter schools that are alternative schools that are catching kids that the other schools have kind of let fall through the cracks. So both of those serve and fit a certain niche in the community. So I think that choice is good. What I don't necessarily like is the apples to apples comparison, because they're not. You know, if you think about how much most public high schools spend on extracurricular activities, sports and programs like that, the charter schools just, they don't do that. In Arizona, if you're a charter school, you don't have to contribute to the state retirement, so you can offer people more money because you're not taking 11.5% of their pay and putting it into the retirement. You're not matching that, so it's not 23%, which is, I mean, these are Arizona political issues. So we get compared to schools that are serving different intentions and groups, and to say they're all equal is really kind of not a fair comparison. But for the most part, I think we found a pretty good way to make things work in Arizona. It could always get better, but I do like choice, and they are all public schools.
First, I have to correct something I said earlier. I said that Vermont didn't have vouchers. It actually does have vouchers at the high school level in towns that don't have high school.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
Yeah,
there are
but
towns
it doesn't
small enough
have,
in Vermont that there's no
There
high
are
school.
towns that don't have high schools. They have school board members, though, but they don't have high
Yeah.
schools. But we don't have charter schools. However, my feeling about charter schools actually is if they're public charter schools, it kind of fits in with the whole school choice idea that I supported earlier. And if they're private charter schools, I'm much more concerned for the same reasons that we already discussed.
And to my knowledge, we don't have private charter schools. If you are a charter, you receive public funds and you are accountable to the State Department of Education. So they are public schools. They just have a little different regulation.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So moving on to another, non-controversial issue. Educators who responded to our survey had pretty mixed views on immigration. About 40% said they thought it was a good thing for schools, and another 44% said the impact was mixed. And we didn't ask about undocumented immigrants versus, you can in your answer differentiate if you feel like it's a different answer. So I'm wondering, what are your views on immigration, and how has that topic just in general impacted your school and your community? Dennis, why don't you go first? Because I know you ran for office, and this was a big issue when you ran, and not surprisingly in Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, we're 60 miles from the border with Mexico. I think that, well, my school is about 50% white, 50% minority. The largest single group in the minority would be Hispanic students. So we have several native Spanish speakers. It's not, we don't have a very large ELL program. But I think it's just common sense. It's a reflection of the diversity of our nation. I mean, our nation is changing. And so having kids experience it, I think kids are way better at being connected to other kids' needs and how they're different than maybe, at least than I was when I was a kid, for sure. And so I don't see it as a problem. I see it as the direction we're going, and I think kids embrace that really well, and it's not really much of an issue for students.
I mean, in my opinion, we're stronger as a school. We're stronger as a community. We're stronger as a nation when we have diversity. And it would be hard for me to understand why someone would say it's bad for schools. Period. Like I would have to kind of unpack that answer from somebody.
I do feel really strongly about this issue and very much in support of having a diverse student body and in support of immigration. My own kids are children of Vietnamese refugees. I ran a school system that had over 50 languages. It was a refugee resettlement center, Burlington, Vermont, and it had over 50 different languages in the high school of people all over the world. I think that that exposure to different cultures, to different viewpoints, to different thoughts are hugely important for our kids' success. I think that I have seen from experience kids who come from largely white Vermont, outside of Chittenden County, struggle more when they get to colleges that they leave Vermont for because they just haven't simply been exposed to any differences. And so I've seen how it plays out. If you're not in a diverse student body system, it can be difficult.
Okay, so we have time for, I think, one more question, so we'll do it lightning round style if we can. We've gotten all the way to the end of our panel without mentioning Betsy DeVos, so I felt like now's the time, right? Most of the educators we surveyed, even Republicans, even Trump supporters, don't approve of her performance as secretary. So what do you think of her job performance so far? And actually, I'm really curious about this as the reporter who covers the education department. How much of a difference does the inner workings of the department actually matter to your day-to-day? So what do you think of her job performance, and how much does what she's doing matter to you?
I'll jump in. I don't think she has performed.
Okay, that was succinct.
And I think that until Betsy DeVos was in office, I didn't realize how much the education department doesn't need to affect me.
Huh, okay.
At the same time, I'm very concerned with decisions being made, particularly with the removal of guidance around a number of different issues.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I would guess it's a bigger issue at the superintendent level than at the building principal level. There's very little that happens there that doesn't trickle down several steps before it gets to me, and implementation issues. So I would say it doesn't have a big impact. Obviously, she's been in the news more than other.
Yeah, you're telling me.
You know, right? So, you know, my question is, was she ever qualified for the job? That's really more the question for me.
Was that a rhetorical question?
I think everybody has an answer for that one.
Agreed. I mean, I'd just go circle back to the modeling thing. And do we want our leaders to, what kind of stance do we want them to take about issues and about how we use government? And I'm not sure I agree with the way that she's led or not led the Department of Education. And it shows. And being in DC and knowing people at the department, the morale is down. It feels different, even if it's not daily affecting me in the classroom.
I would love to talk to you guys all more about that first story, but unfortunately we have to wrap up. Thank you guys so much. It was really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dennis, Jean, and Topher. If you'll walk towards me, we'll get you unmiked over here. And Allison, you stay right where you are. Well, actually kind of move over. That's super.
Okay.
Andrew and Mark are going to now join. Andrew Ujifusa, our associate editor, who also is our Allison's co-blogger for Politics K-12 blog. I hope some of you are readers. They will be now joining you for a discussion about the changes, challenges, and the unfinished business in store for Congress and the White House in the aftermath of this year's midterms and in the narrow window before the 2020 elections.
Okay, hi again. I want to say hello again to Andrew and to Allison, who I see each day. They are key members of the Education Week's Government and Politics team. They are the co-bloggers on the Politics K-12 blog, and that keeps everybody informed on daily doings having to do with federal education policy every day. And this is a kind of a perfect handoff, I think, from the last discussion. I think between the two of you, you really cover the waterfront on federal policy, from the White House and the Education Department to Congress, and blogging each day. So I'd really like to start out kind of picking up the ball from the last discussion to ask you, Allison, what's next for Betsy DeVos in this post-election world?
So obviously, as most people here know, Betsy DeVos came in and everybody was expecting her to push a big school choice initiative. And I think she was expecting to push a big school choice initiative. And it just really hasn't gone anywhere, even with Republicans in charge of both the House and the Senate. And obviously, after the most recent election, you know, the Republicans lost the House, the Democrats will now be in charge. So if her agenda was already pretty dead on school choice, it's like super dead now, extra dead. There's really no chance that the Democrats will go along with a private school voucher program, which is something she's pitched, a tuition tax credit scholarship program, which is something she was working on kind of behind the scenes, or even just allowing federal money to follow students to the public school of their choice. Maybe eventually Congress would do that, but it would be many years down the road. It won't be this next Congress, and it won't likely be under this secretary. She's also pitched some big budget cuts to the department, $5 billion, I believe, last year. Again, those were rebuffed by Congress. You know, she and President Trump wanted to get rid of the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, which is the biggest program for after school. Title II, which a lot of you probably know is the biggest program for teachers. They proposed doing away with those programs. The Republican Congress said no, a Democratic Congress is going to say like hell no. So it's going to be a tough couple of years for her. And I think Andrew can talk a little bit more about how often she'll be coming to Capitol Hill on oversight issues.
But before we get to that, I was just going to ask if she's not going to make traction on these signature issues that she wanted to push, what are they going to do? I mean, what is there to the administration's education agenda then if these are basically dead-ended in a couple of different areas?
So they've gotten interested, first of all, in changing the structure of the department. I don't know, in our last panel we heard that doesn't have a huge impact on the classroom level, but they've talked about things like getting rid of the office of main office for English language learners. That office has a pretty small budget, but they do important research. Betsy DeVos and her team want to fold that into the larger K-12 office. They say that would help infuse English language learners and concentration on English language learners kind of throughout all K-12 programs, but many in the ELL and civil rights community are really concerned that they kind of won't have a dedicated home for their issues. So there'll be a lot of, I guess, kind of bureaucratic, it sounds, that seems trivial to say rearranging of deck chairs, but it may end up being that, just kind of changing around offices. She's also spent a lot of time getting rid of Obama administration directives. She's expected to shortly probably call for getting rid of, or at least significantly changing guidance that the Obama administration had put out on discipline disparities. And she may do that as part of her school safety push. And so a lot of shrinking of the federal role, a lot of, taking down Obama guidance, and probably a lot of coming up to Capitol Hill to answer to lawmakers about especially the way that she's handled civil rights issues.
Well, this is a good handoff to Andrew, who is our primary congressional reporter. There may be more action or at least more noise in the current Congress, with the changes that are taking place there.
Yeah, so I don't know how many people in the audience think our federal lawmakers exercise a lot of foresight, but if you're a fan of oversight, particularly on the House side, you might soon be in a better mood because, as many of you probably anticipate, there will be quite a bit of that regarding Betsy DeVos, both in the Education Committee, where Bobby Scott is the incumbent chairman, and in other committees as well. As was alluded to, there will be a lot of oversight and questions that Democrats will have for DeVos about her moves on civil rights. Keep in mind that Bobby Scott is a former civil rights attorney. He's also the second African-American to hold the post as chairman once he takes office. Lawmakers will also be asking her about her approach to the Every Student Succeeds Act. Lawmakers on the Democratic side for close to 2 years now have been saying that the plans that she has approved do not adequately or do not conform to the law when it comes to taking into account low-performing students and low-performing schools. I have been told that we shouldn't expect to see DeVos twice a week, so if you were looking forward to that kind of programming, you might be a little disappointed. You might see some deputies for her like Ken Marcus, who oversees the Office for Civil Rights, and Frank Brogan, who oversees elementary and secondary education. You might see folks like that in the mix called up by House Democrats to Capitol Hill. So you might not see as much of Betsy DeVos, quite as much as people might think.
You mentioned Congressman Scott. Are there other players in Congress that we ought to be watching that may kind of either rise or fall in this new environment?
Yeah, so I think obviously the first person I think many people would mention is Lamar Alexander, who will continue as the chairman of the Senate Education Committee. There are a couple of things to keep in mind about Alexander. It's not clear he's going to run again in 2020 when he's up. But even if he does, after 2020, he will be termed out, so to speak, of his chairmanship of the Education Committee. Now, for a while, it's been his priority to get a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act done. 2 years ago, that looked like the odds might be decent. Now, that effort with Patty Murray and on the House side has fallen through. Now it will be interesting to see if he can make a deal with Bobby Scott and others to reauthorize the higher education law, similar, I should point out, to what was done with the Every Student Succeeds Act potentially in 2015. So it will be interesting to see how Alexander approaches that decision. Another lawmaker to watch just quickly is Rosa DeLauro, who is going to be the House lawmaker in charge of basically the Education Department appropriations in the subcommittee. She is very vocal and very oppositional to many Betsy DeVos initiatives. One more thing I should say about Scott is that he's not one of these lawmakers who appears a lot on CNN. He's understated, and to use a British expression, he's not fond of giving people the hair dryer. He doesn't shout, he doesn't scream, but he is very focused on civil rights in particular, as well as ESSA.
You recently wrote a piece for Education Week about the most recent Congress, what they did or what they didn't do. And can you talk a little bit about that and what kind of unfinished business is there out there?
Yeah, if you want some light reading, you can check out that piece. They didn't get a great deal done. Probably their signature accomplishment in terms of passing a law, as people understand it, was a reauthorization of the Perkins Career and Technical Education Law, which Trump signed into law over the summer. It was something the Trump administration wanted. It was something that the business community wanted. It was overdue for reauthorization by about 10 years. And so once it got momentum behind it, it passed relatively quickly and relatively easily. One thing we noted at the start of Trump's term was that Congress got rid of Obama-era regulations regarding ESSA and school accountability, which Republicans like Alexander really didn't like, thought it was too restrictive, as well as Obama rules for teacher preparation. After that, the list thins out pretty quickly. They passed appropriations bills for the Education Department, although, as I wrote, praising people for that is sort of like praising people for brushing their teeth. It's sort of a low bar to cross.
Well, you mentioned higher education. I was going to ask you, Allison. The higher education bill, there's a lot of attention to higher education in the current department and in Congress. What's up with that? Why higher education, not so much K-12? Have the K-12 issues kind of fallen off the agenda?
So before this crew, the Trump crew, came in, Congress had already passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was, a long time coming, reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, and that kind of settled a lot of K-12 issues for a while. Probably the most important thing that the Republican Congress and Secretary DeVos and President Trump did on education, they did in the first 100 days of Congress when they got rid of the Obama administration's, and this is very wonky, but it really mattered, I promise, accountability regulations for ESSA. So essentially, Republicans in Congress and President Trump and Secretary DeVos felt like those regulations went too far in restricting the state role, that they kind of kept a bigger federal role than there needed to be. The civil rights organizations and actually some state leaders were like, well, no, it actually gives a lot of clarity on important parts of the law, and we want these regulations to stay in place, but they got rid of them. And then once that was done, there wasn't really all that much left to do, right? Because ESSA had already passed. Secretary DeVos did need to approve, and she has approved all 50 state plans. But she used, as one would expect for somebody who really believes in a smaller federal role, she used a pretty light touch on that. On the other hand, though, the Higher Education Act is still up. I think that, Bobby Scott, who we heard Andrew talk about, and Lamar Alexander may even take a go at trying to come up with some sort of a bipartisan reauthorization there. So higher ed is kind of a hotter policy in that way. And the federal ESSA had a whole list of prohibitions on the secretary's role in education. And those were put in partly because Republicans and even some Democrats in Congress really felt like the Obama administration overreached. So if there's this whole section of ESSA, if you're like a Washington policy nerd, it's actually really fun to read. Where it just talks about all of the things the secretary is not allowed to do, and almost every one of them is something like Arne Duncan did. Like you can look back on the calendar and be like, oh, no interfering with teacher evaluation. Arne Duncan did that in December, and you just go through. So it wouldn't have mattered really who the next president was. It could have been Hillary Clinton, and it could have been a secretary who really believed in a big federal role, and they still would have been facing this whole litany of restrictions. So you've got all the restrictions plus a secretary who doesn't believe in a big federal role in K-12, and so K-12 just hasn't been a really hot issue. Whereas higher ed, there's no list of restrictions in the Higher Education Act. There is a lot that the federal government is allowed to do on that. Student loans was actually, we didn't write about it a ton because we're a K-12 publication, but student loans were a huge issue during the Obama years. There was a lot of curbing of what for-profit colleges can do through a very wonky regulation known as gainful employment. And now, just like the Trump administration is undoing much of the Obama administration's civil rights guidance, they're undoing many of those things on higher ed, and that takes up a lot of energy that otherwise might be spent on K-12.
Now, I want to return to something that I mentioned earlier in the day, that we're going to do some crystal ball gazing, and we do have the title of the event is 2020 Vision. So I wanted to ask, really, what's the education buzz around some of the possible presidential contenders for 2020 who may be out there kind of polishing up their resumes at this point?
So Andrew and I did a blog post a couple weeks ago where I think, how many people were in that post? Like
close to 30.
30, okay. So we looked, and one of them was Oprah, so we cast a wide net of what various people who are thinking about maybe possibly running for president, what their views have been on education. And I guess some of the main folks to mention, just because more because their track records in education are a little interesting. One would be Cory Booker, who originally was sort of like the original pro-voucher Democrat. That was really interesting. And he worked with Facebook to get all this money for New York City schools when he was the mayor there. Then now that he's in Congress, he's suddenly, and he had actually spoken at, because he's a pro-voucher Democrat, he had spoken at Betsy DeVos's, she used to run a group called, most of you probably know this, the American Federation for Children, which was a pro-voucher organization. He spoke at their conference, Cory Booker did, and then when she was nominated for Secretary of Education, he wasn't like, oh great, let's all vote for my friend Betsy. He was like, this would be terrible, she'd be a terrible Secretary of Education, because he's kind of positioning himself to run in 2020. So that's one to watch. Andrew, what do you think, who else would be?
Well, I think that a lot of you are familiar with the names. I would say one thing to keep in mind, especially on the Democratic side, is that it's going to be really interesting to see how the candidates approach the unions, especially after this year of educator activism and all the attention that was given by we in the media and other people to teachers engaging with politics. And so I think there is going to be quite a lot of effort put in by candidates as they get more serious to establishing links with the NEA and AFT. And in turn, the NEA and AFT are going to have sort of things to navigate in terms of who do we endorse, when do we endorse, because as Allison can talk about, their endorsement process when it came to 2008, for example, in 2016, not the smoothest process for them. So
in 2008, NEA did not endorse any candidate in the primary. They stayed neutral between, at the time, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And then Barack Obama got the nomination without any help from them. And then for the next 8 years, he proceeded to pass a bunch of policies and enact a bunch of policies that they did not like teacher evaluation through test scores, really big expansions of charter schools. So they made a really early endorsement of Hillary Clinton in 2016, hoping that she would really be tied to them, she would owe the nomination to them. But that backfired because a lot of their supporters actually really wanted them to endorse Bernie Sanders and got really mad at them. So it'll be interesting to see how they play at this time with such a big field. What I'm actually really curious about is if you look at many of the issues that Democrats ran on in 2018, who are running for governor or state chief or senate, they really weren't talking about a lot of the things that we've been talking about up here, like testing and accountability and school turnarounds. Like, they really weren't talking about that. They were talking about things like career and technical education, education funding, expanding pre-kindergarten, social and emotional learning and the importance of that. So that's really where the focus has shifted. And I wonder if we're going to see sort of 30 different education platforms that all look the same, or if somebody will try to differentiate themselves by, for instance, deciding that it would be a good idea to back off of annual testing, which would be a really, I guess, provocative, interesting move to make. Might make the teachers' unions really happy. It would make the civil rights groups a lot less happy.
So to what extent has really kind of the action shifted to the state level? Can we see some of that with the new governors who are coming in? And I know that we heard from the NGA person a little bit earlier today and from Maria, talking about new governor names as folks who may be throwing their hat in the ring at a certain point?
Yeah, I think that thanks to ESSA and also to a department that doesn't believe in a very strong federal role, a lot of the action has shifted to the states. And there are definitely some really interesting governors to watch who were elected in 2018. Obviously, one of them is Tony Evers, who just barely won in Wisconsin, being able to unseat Scott Walker. Tony Evers was previously the state schools chief. Wisconsin is one of the states that has a voucher program. Tony Evers is not a fan of vouchers. He wants to see big increases to education funding. He's going to have to deal with a Republican legislature. So he's an interesting governor to watch. Another one would be Laura Kelly in Kansas. She won basically running on increasing education funding in one of the reddest states in the country, which is also really, Kansas has really starved K-12 schools for quite a while, and there's a lawsuit going on, and she wants to see that funding increased. Be interesting to see if she's able to do that with a Republican legislature. And then the new governor of Colorado is a gentleman named Jared Polis, who many of you in Washington probably know. He was one of the biggest charter school supporters among Democrats in Congress. So it'll be interesting to see how he takes that sort of education reform perspective and brings it to the governor's mansion in Colorado.
Andrew, I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, talking about the teachers' unions as trying to find their role, their pressure points here. If you and Allison can maybe just talk a little bit about where are the kind of the traditional advocacy groups, civil rights groups, or various different advocacy groups, where are they likely to be putting their pressure in the next 2 years? Because we know whether we've had a lineup of a discussion having to do with what the Trump administration may be having in the way of unfinished business and in Congress. Do you have a sense yet of what other interest groups really are going to be putting their energies into?
I think it'll be a mix, like at lots of other different points. I mean, I think it would be a mistake to say that there won't be a lot of attention on Washington, because every time the Democrats in the House get Betsy DeVos in public testifying, there are going to be all different kinds of groups trying to get their questions asked through members of Congress on that committee. So there's going to be a lot of attention on that. And as many of you know, Betsy DeVos has made news up on the Hill in ways that she often did not intend, that Democrats are very happy about, which maybe they'll try and fold into 2020 messaging when the time comes. I don't know. So there will be a lot of pressure on that. But we write about ESSA a lot, and I think that I think there will be continuing pressure by civil rights advocacy groups, in particular at the state level, to ensure that states are not slipping up when it comes to underperforming schools and disadvantaged students. Alice, I don't know if I stole your thunder there.
No, that's pretty. I think that was a good answer. I do think there's not a lot of, like during the Obama years, we saw a lot of friction between civil rights groups and teachers unions on areas like testing and even to some extent some civil rights enforcement. I don't think that now they all are united in their hatred of Trump and Betsy DeVos. So I don't think they're like that. A lot of that friction that we saw during the Obama years has been put on hold.
Interesting. We have some time for questions from the audience. If folks have questions for our political team here, I would like to mention at this point also that we had hoped to have Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici here for this event today. She had RSVP'd. She was to be here because of leadership votes that are taking place today on Capitol Hill. She's not able to be with us. It's just impossible while the leadership votes are taking place. The same is also true for Congresswoman-elect Jahana Hayes, who you saw a video of a little bit earlier today. She was to have been here in person, but because of the leadership votes that are happening, she was not able to be there. I really would encourage everybody to tune into edweek.org. Our reporter, Madeline Will, had an exclusive sit-down interview with Jahana Hayes 2 days ago. A very interesting 30-minute session, and we will be posting that on edweek.org, so you'll be able to hear her expand on her policy positions and her thoughts about going forward. And we're open for any questions. Really appreciate this.
Well, I wanted to say thank you very much for joining all of us. If we have no questions, we're going to close the day here. I want to thank Alice and Andrew and Mark, if we could, for their insights and their expertise today. And you guys can exit if you wish. This would be a good time. I want to encourage you, trust that you've all will enjoy the lighting of the National Christmas tree, which is happening next door and going to cause a hubbub on your way home, which I trust will be exciting and fun. We hope everyone online decides to join us here live in 2 years when we bring you 2020 election results with a distinctly K-12 edge. We're going to see all of you then, but for now, for everybody in the room, there are desserts aplenty outside of the table for you guys as you exit. Please take as many as you like. Before we go, we hope we will fill out the evaluation. Again, that's on the screen here. That's bit.ly/EdElect 2018. And we want to thank all of the EdWeek and the GW staff here that's made today's event possible. And thanks in particular to the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University, and of course Dean Michael Foyer and his team for his support and theirs. Without the university's support, today simply would not have happened. Thanks again for many of our special guests, for all of our special guests, and to all of you guys in the audience today for bringing us a little 2020 vision from this 2018 election. Have a very happy holidays. Thank you everybody for coming.